Symbolic Exchange and Death Theory, Culture and Society. By Jean Baudrillard. 1976. Publisher, Sage Publications, Inc. Converted to audiobook format by the Morbid Analyst. Translated by Lane Hamilton Grant. With an introduction by Mike Gain. Sound file number 1 contains Table of Contents. Introduction by Mike Gain. Preface 1. Part 1, The End of Production. Contents. 1. The End of Production. 6. The Structural Revolution of Value. 6. The End of Production. 9. Labor. 12. Wages. 19. Money. 20. Strikes. 23. Political economy as a model of simulation. 31. Labor and death. 38. Notes. 43. 2. The Order of Simulacra. 50. The Three Orders of Simulacra. 50. The Stucco Angel. 50. The Automaton and the Robot. 53. The Industrial Simulacrum. 55. The Metaphysics of the Code. 57. The Tactile and the Digital. 61. The Hyperrealism of Simulation. 70. Cool Killer, or the Insurrection of Signs. 76. Notes. 84. 3. Fashion, or the Enchanting Spectacle of the Code. 87. The Frivolity of the Déjà Vu. 87. The Structure of Fashion. 89. The Flotation of Signs. 92. The Pulsion of Fashion. 93. Sex Refashioned. 95. The Insubvertible. 98. Notes. 99. Page V. Page 6. 4. The Body, or the Mass Grave of Signs. 101. The Marked Body. 101. Secondary Nudity. 104. Striptease. 107. Planned Narcissism. 111. Incestuous Manipulation. 112. Models of the Body. 114. Phallus Exchange Standard. 114. Demagogy of the Body. 116. Apologue. 118. Zhuangzi's Butcher. 119. Notes. 121. 5. Political Economy and Death. 125. The Extradition of the Dead. 125. Survival, or the equivalent to death. 127. The Ghetto Beyond the Grave. 127. Death Power. 129. The Exchange of Death in the Primitive Order. 131. 133. Symbolic/real/imaginary. The Inevitable Exchange. 134. The Unconscious in the Primitive Order. 135. The Double and the Split. 140. Political Economy and Death. 144. The Death Drive. 148. Death in Italy. 154. My Death is Everywhere, My Death Dreams. 158. Punctual Death, Biological Death. 158. The Accident and the Catastrophe. 160. Natural Death. 162. Old Age and Retirement, the Third Age. 163. Natural Death and Sacrificial Death. 164. The Death Penalty. 166. Security as Blackmail. 177. Funeral homes and catacombs. 180. The dereliction of death. 182. The exchange of disease. 183. Sexualized death and deadly sex. 184. My death is everywhere, my death dreams. 185. Notes. 187. 6. The extermination of the name of God. 195. The anagram. 195. The poetic as the extermination of value. 198. The end of the anathema. 205. Page 6. Page 7. The 9 billion names of God. 210. The linguistic imaginary. 213. The wits, or the phantasm of the economic in Freud. 222. An anti-materialist theory of language. 233. Beyond the unconscious. 236. Notes. 238. Bibliography of works. By Jean Baudrillard. 243. Index 249. Page 7. Page 8. Introduction. Mike Gain. Symbolic Exchange and Death, published in France in 1976, is without doubt Jean Baudrillard's most important book. It appeared alongside works by Claude Lévi-Strauss and Michel Foucault in Gallimard's prestigious series Bibliothèque des Sciences Humaines. It is remarkable in many respects that it has taken some years for the full impact of Baudrillard's work to be felt in English-speaking cultures, and then under something of a misunderstanding. For various complex reasons Baudrillard's name is associated with postmodernism, indeed he has often been called the high priest of postmodernism, yet it is clear that Baudrillard's own relationship with postmodernism is hardly positive. The interest in postmodernism has certainly served Baudrillard, for there is enormous curiosity in establishing just what Baudrillard's position is if it is not postmodern. The translation and publication of Symbolic Exchange and Death will be decisive in this respect. The great interest in Baudrillard's work in recent years has led to a sudden flood of translations, and this has not been without its own problems, for works written at many years' distance have appeared in English as contemporaneous publications. The first work to appear in translation was The Mirror of Production in 1975, French original 1973. Followed in 1981 by For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, originally 1972. Parts of Symbolic Exchange and Death became available in 1981 in journal article form, and in 1983 in the collection Simulations by Semiotext, in New York, a publishing house which subsequently published In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, 1983, originally. 1978, Forget Foucault, 1987, originally 1977, and The Ecstasy of Communication, 1988, originally 1987. 2 books of selected writings, Jean Baudrillard, Selected Writings, 1988, and Revenge of the Crystal, 1990, are now available in English, as are Seduction, 1990, originally 1979, Fatal Strategies, 1990, originally 1983, Cool Memories, 1990, originally 1987, and Transparency of Evil, 1993, originally 1990. The year 1993 will also see the publication of Baudrillard Live, a selection of interviews. The question arises therefore of how to make sense of this corpus and how does Symbolic Exchange and Death figure in it. First of all, some background on Jean Baudrillard himself. He was born. Page 8. Page 9. In Reims in 1929. His formation and early teaching experience was as a Germanist. He wrote an early thesis on Nietzsche and Luther, and was particularly interested in the work of Hölderlin. His first publications were literary critical essays in Les Temps modernes, 19623. He was also interested in photography. An edited book of photographs was published in 1963, an interest he still maintains. In December 1992 there was an exhibition of his photographs in a gallery on the Champs-Élysées. In the 1960s he was the principal translator of the works of Peter Weiss into French, but he also translated Brecht and a sociological work on Third World millenarian movements by Wilhelm Mulhmann. In the 1960s he converted to sociology under the influence of Henri Lefebvre and Roland Barthes. Most of his university teaching career was at Nanterre in Paris. In the late 1960s he was associated with Utopie and later with Traverses, both radical journals outside the orthodox organization of the left. He was deeply influenced by situationism but was never attached in any formal manner. In the 1970s he began to travel to the USA, about which he wrote the book America. 1988, originally 1986, but also more widely, as is partially documented in his Cool Memories. Initially, his main axis of travel in Europe was Paris-Milan-Barcelona, which today has become Paris-Berlin-Madrid. He has recently spent time in Berlin as well as Argentina and Brazil, and has made a rare visit to Britain. He reckons to spend about half of his time out of France. It comes as no surprise that Baudrillard has a growing world reputation. Indeed, he was the subject of a recent conference in Montana in 1990, published as Jean Baudrillard, Stearns and Chalupka, 1992, and that in recent surveys he ranks in the leading half-dozen French intellectuals in terms of citations and translations. The flood of translations of Baudrillard's works has been accompanied by commentaries from writers such as Frederick Jameson, Douglas Kellner, and Arthur and Marie-Louise Croker. By and large these writers have tried to link Baudrillard's ideas with postmodernism. Jameson used Baudrillard to fill out a conception of postmodernism as the cultural formation of late capitalism. In effect, this line was taken a great deal further by Arthur and Marie-Louise Croker. Douglas Kellner first presented Baudrillard as the major postmodern theorist but later altered the thesis, admitting that in reality Baudrillard's writings were generally extremely hostile to postmodernism. Kellner's book on Baudrillard, 1989, is an attempt to argue that he is a dangerous writer whose position needs to be entirely rejected. Yet there is still a sense in which the relation to Baudrillard is one of repulsion and attraction. Even Kellner points to the insightful and brilliant analyses in Symbolic Exchange and Death, Kellner, 1989, 102. Baudrillard's position in the System of Objects, 1968, but even more so in the Consumer Society, 1970, seems influenced by a Marxist point of view. But there is a violent reaction to Marxism in The Mirror of Production, 1973, that leads to the new synthesis that is explored in Symbolic Exchange and Death, 1976. A Formula in for a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, 1981, originally 1972, The Semiological. Page 9. Page X. Reduction of the symbolic properly constitutes the ideological process, p. 98, can be taken as a key statement of Baudrillard's object. It was at that time very clearly considered an analysis of crucial processes within capitalist society. An ideological reduction to the capitalist system of order and social values, p. 100. Certainly in the years leading up to 1972 Baudrillard seemed to be working within a Marxist framework. He referred to the capitalist mode of production as the basis of the social formation. In 1970, with his book The Consumer Society, it was clear that unlike more orthodox Marxists, he saw that affluence and consumption has profound consequences for social structure and cultural integration. Marxists like Althusser talked of the key role of social class reproduction in the family and the school, ideological apparatuses of the state. Baudrillard talked of the power of consumption and repressive ambience in a line of thought influenced by Barthes, Marcuse, and McLuhan. It became clear, however, that the critical base, the theoretical position, from which Baudrillard undertook his analyses, was somewhat ambivalent. On the one hand, there is in this period a gesture to the importance of the proletarian position. There is also increasing reference to the significance of an order higher than that of the semiotic culture. He called this the symbolic order, a more radical if more primordial basis. At first, the symbolic order is discussed with reference to the famous analysis of gift exchange by Marcel Mauss, see Baudrillard, 1981, originally 1972, 64 ff. This is an initial study, the first of a long series of oppositions between the symbolic and the semiotic order. Thus it is essential to clarify the nature of these two concepts. Of course, this cannot be done definitively since many of the concepts have been modified through the course of Baudrillard's subsequent evolution. It is Baudrillard's own account of the sacred culture defined by Durkheim in the elementary forms of the religious life, 1915, it is that defined by Max Weber as the enchanted world of traditional societies, it is the fatalistic culture of peasants. For Baudrillard, Marx was not sufficiently radical in his analysis. It was not use value which should have been contrasted with exchange value, but symbolic exchange which should have been contrasted with commodity exchange. Baudrillard's reading of Marx suggests that his conception of communism was trapped within the matrix of the cultural order of rationalization and therefore could not be other than its bad mirror image. Like Mauss, Baudrillard suggests the superiority of the symbolic order over the semiotic order, the obligation of gift over the cash nexus, while witnessing the apparent destruction of the former by the latter. Against the Marxists, Baudrillard appears more radical, and more primitive. But there are surprises. Baudrillard does not simply document the course of the destruction of the symbolic order but analyzes the ironic evolution of the semiotic order itself. If we turn to symbolic exchange and death, we can follow the analyses of the ideological process. Chapter 1, on Capitalism and Production, is perhaps a crucial analysis. It is curious in many respects. It is written in a page X, page 11, highly rhetorical style, playful, willfully malicious. Although the analyses of simulation, fashion, sexuality, death, are likely to be more celebrated, this first chapter in a sense is more fundamental, yet the text is both assertive, dogmatic and at the same time elusive. The writing is in the main unsupported by any burden of evidence or any attempt at systematic argument, as if a highly perverse dialectical mania had grasped the writer. First of all, Baudrillard presents the thesis that in order to grasp the nature of modern capitalism, it must be thought of not as a mode of production but as a code dominated by the structural law of value. This term is obviously developed from Marx's own law of value, but here it detaches itself from economics and becomes a mechanism which invades all cultural spheres. In other words, all spheres can be analyzed as the process of the political economy of the sign. Baudrillard insists in fact that the development of modern society is uneven, and like Weber argues that the process first attacks art, politics, and culture and then the economy itself. The economy, after having passed through a specific phase of simulation known as the capitalist mode of production, the phase of the factory, etc., undergoes an ironic logic, since the mode of production inverts itself and begins to destroy the very separations it was built upon. Capital itself proceeds to destroy the hierarchy of base and superstructure, of production and reproduction, of labor and capital. There are two steps in the argument which must be examined. The first is the argument concerning the nature of the change of the terms within the capitalist mode of production. The second is the argument concerning the relation between the symbolic order and capitalism. The character of the former argument is perhaps best grasped as process occurring at an already advanced stage of the destruction of the natural economy of primitive symbolic exchange. The argument follows on from that presented in the mirror of production. For Baudrillard, the primitive society has no mode of production. Indeed, perhaps industrial factory capitalism is the only mode of production that has existed as such. However, once the structural law of value attacks the elements of the system, the code becomes determinant, ending any order of causation between the spheres of production and consumption. Hence the historical dialectic between them comes to an end. Baudrillard produces the irony of the Althusserian version of Marx, which suggested that reproduction, class struggle, was determinant in history, for Baudrillard suggests that when reproduction becomes dominant, labor and production change their sense, they lose their finality, that is, they lose their rationality as purposeful work as they become reproduced for the sake of the reproduction of work itself. This idea reflects the great change that has occurred in Western societies in relation to the meaning of the term alienation. When this happens, all elements in the system are affected as the proletariat is incorporated into the social order. Trade unions, strikes, revolts such as May 68 lose their claim to justice and radically. Indeed, the organizations and theoreticians who mark time with insistence on the centrality of production end. Page 11. Page 12. Labor and those who believe in the use value of their labor power, the proletariat, are virtually the most mystified and the least susceptible to this revolt. P. 30 below. Baudrillard reorganizes the theory of resistance and revolt from one based on internal system contradiction, Marx, to that of exclusion and excommunication, Durkheim and Mauss. The second element in the argument is the scope and role Baudrillard gives to the symbolic order within the capitalist system. It almost appears as a replacement for the notion of a social infrastructure, and on occasions Baudrillard has formulations which approach this image. It is a mistake, then, to think that symbolic exchange and death is simply about the ideological process of the reduction of the symbolic by the semiotic. It is also about the eruption of the symbolic within the semiotic. The challenge, the stake is, he says, a dimension immanent in the code, p. 39 below. In an analysis which at first sight appears slightly facile, the terms Baudrillard uses to analyze capitalism reverse all previous conceptions. The capitalist presents the gift of work to the proletarian. Because the proletarian cannot return this gift and cannot cancel it, he cannot cancel the power of the capitalist. But the position and order of the capitalist is vulnerable. Nonetheless, since Baudrillard claims nothing can evade symbolic obligation, indeed not even the system itself. Terrorism, the taking of hostages, sacrificial martyrdom, are challenges to the system which pass into the symbolic order. If there is a strategy in Baudrillard's work, perhaps this is where it is discussed. The fundamental challenge to the semiotic system will be in the form of a gift which it will not be able to return. Pages 3643 below. The chapters which follow study themes directly related to the apparent destruction of the symbolic by the semiotic order. The chapter on simulation discusses the genealogy of the orders of simulation from the counterfeit, through production proper to the hyper-real order itself. Chapter 3 examines the case of fashion and the fashion cycle, which is crucial to the analysis of consumer society and the commutation of all cultural elements, even the most apparently critical, to the code of fashion and its temporality. Chapter 4 examines the body and sexuality. Here the phallus exchange standard operates as a cultural parallel with the law of value, determining a specific destruction of the radical difference between the sexes and the symbolic exchanges based on it. In the next chapter, on death, Baudrillard presents a genealogy of the dead, the destruction of the original unities of life and death and the rituals which integrated they. Relations between generations in traditional societies. In the final chapter, Baudrillard uses Saussure against Saussure. The great analyst of the sign, the originator of structural linguistics and semiology, Saussure also wrote voluminous notebooks on the hidden anagrams in classical literature. Baudrillard argues that this provides a clue to reading such poetry not as accumulation but as sacrificial, cyclical, as prestation and cancellation, extermination. This chapter also includes a critique of the Freudian analysis of jokes seen as complicit with the order of accumulation and repression. After Symbolic Exchange and Death was published in 1976, Baudrillard, page 12, page 13, published a number of brilliant short articles and reviews: a critical review of Foucault, a critique of the architecture of the Pompidou Center, etc., as well as a set of poems called L'Ange de Stuc, the Stucco Angel. His next major work was Seduction, published in 1979. This developed the theme of the opposition of seduction to the semiotic and masculine principle of production. It suggested a return of the principle of seduction in consumer society, but in a changed form. That of the ludic, a cool seduction. In 1983, Baudrillard published Fatal Strategies, which charted the collapse of agency in a society dominated by the code and the phenomena which accompanied the disappearance of the constraints of the dialectic. It became clear that a crucial influence on Baudrillard, apart from Marx, Freud, Saussure, and Mauss, was Nietzsche. The latter's anti-modernist aphoristic style was evident in Baudrillard's Cool Memories, published in 1987, one of Baudrillard's most successful works. In recent years, Baudrillard has published Transparency of Evil, The Illusion of the End, and a collection of articles on the Gulf War. These works continue the analysis of the apparent destruction of the symbolic by the semiotic and the subsequent ironic evolution of the semiotic order. They still draw on the theory and analyses of symbolic exchange and death. In fact, at points are almost unintelligible without a knowledge of that text. Indeed, in a recent interview, 1991, Baudrillard drew attention to the fact that in France Symbolic Exchange and Death was the last book that inspired any confidence. Everything is deemed brilliant, intelligent, but not serious. There has never been any real discussion about it. I don't claim to be tremendously serious, but there are nevertheless some philosophically serious things in my work. In the fine arts milieu I was received fairly well, but with such misunderstanding. Baudrillard, 1993, 189. Certainly with this English translation it is evident that many of the misunderstandings that have surrounded the writings of Baudrillard, perhaps far beyond the fine arts milieu, will find they have no textual basis. More than that, of course, the publication of this translation brings to the English-speaking public a document which has already had enormous indirect influence. For those who have wished that Baudrillard would express his argument in more orthodox terms, this is undoubtedly the text where he attempted to do precisely that. References: Baudrillard, J. 1968, Le Système des Objets. Paris, Denoyel. Baudrillard, J. 1970, La Société de Consommation. Paris, Gallimard. Baudrillard, J. 1975, originally 1973, The Mirror of Production. St. Louis, M.O., Telos. Baudrillard, J. 1976, L'échange symbolique et la mort. Paris, Gallimard. Baudrillard, J. 1981, originally 1972, For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, Tr. Charles Lewin. St. Louis. M.O., Telos. Baudrillard, J. 1983, originally 1978, In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, or, The End of the Social and Other Essays. New York, Semiotext, E. Page 13. Page 14. Baudrillard, J. 1983, Simulations, Tr. Paul Foss et.al. New York, Semiotext, E. Baudrillard, J. 1987, Forget Foucault, Trh Bachman and M. Polizzotti. New York, Semiotext, E. Baudrillard, J. 1988, originally 1986, America, T.R.C. Turner. London, Verso. Baudrillard, J. 1988, originally 1987, The Ecstasy of Communication, ed. Silvera Latringer, T.R.B. and C. Schutze. New York, Semiotext, E. Baudrillard, J. 1988, Jean Baudrillard, Selected Writings, ed. Mark Poster, T.R.J. Maurer Rain. Cambridge, Polity. Baudrillard, J. 1990, originally 1979, Seduction, T.R.B. Singer. London, Macmillan. Baudrillard, J. 1990, originally 1983, Fatal Strategies. London, Pluto. Baudrillard, J. 1990, originally 1987, Cool Memories, T.R.C. Turner. London, Verso. Baudrillard, J. 1990, Revenge of the Crystal, Selected Writings on the Modern Object and its Destiny. London, Pluto. Baudrillard, J. 1993, originally 1990, Transparency of Evil, Essays on Extreme Phenomena, T.R.J. Benedict. London, Verso. Baudrillard, J. 1993, Baudrillard Live, Selected Interviews, ed. M. Gain. London, Routledge. Durkheim, E. 1915, originally 1912, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, T.R.J.W. Swain. London, Allen and Unwin. Gain, M. 1991a, Jean Baudrillard, Critical and Fatal Theory. London, Routledge. Gain, M. 1991b, Baudrillard's Bestiary, Baudrillard in Culture. London, Routledge. Kellner, D. 1989, Jean Baudrillard, From Marxism to Postmodernism and Beyond. Cambridge, Polity. Croker, A. 1992, The Possessed Individual, Technology and Postmodernity. London, Macmillan. Pefonis, J. 1991, Heterology and the Postmodern, Baddeley, Baudrillard and Lyotard. London, Duke University Press. Stearns, W. and Chalupka, W.eds. 1992, Jean Baudrillard. London, Macmillan. Page 14. Page 1. Preface. Symbolic exchange is no longer the organizing principle of modern society. Of course, the symbolic haunts modern social institutions in the form of their own death. Indeed, since the symbolic no longer rules these social forms, they experience it only as this haunting, and as a demand forever blocked by the law of value. Even though a certain idea of revolution has, since Marx, attempted to find a way past the law of value, it long since became a revolution in accordance with the law. Even psychoanalysis gravitates around this haunting, which it fends off while at the same time circumscribing it within an individualized unconscious, thus reducing it, under the law of the father, to the obsessional fear of castration. And the signifier. Always the law. However, beyond the topologies and economics, both libidinal and political, gravitating around a materialist or desiring production on the stage of value, an outline of social relations emerges, based on the extermination of value. For us, the model of this relation harks back to primitive formations, but this radical utopia is slowly beginning to intrude at every level of contemporary society. This intoxicating revolt no longer has anything to do with the laws of history, nor even but we will have to wait for a later stage for this to appear, since it is a recent fantasy with the liberation of a desire. In this light, other theoretical events, such as Saussures' anagrams and Mauss's gift exchange, assume cardinal importance. In the long run, these hypotheses are more radical than Marx's or Freud's, whose interpretations are censored by precisely their imperialism. The anagrams or gift exchanges are not merely transitory phases within the disciplines of linguistics and anthropology, nor are they inferior forms compared to the vast machinations of the unconscious and the revolution. Here one predominant form emerges, from which Marxism and psychoanalysis, though they may not be aware of it, derive. This form is equally dismissive of political and libidinal economy, outlining instead a beyond of value, a beyond of the law, a beyond of repression and a beyond of the unconscious. This is taking place here and now. When Freud proposes the theory of the death drive, this is the one theoretical event of the same order as the anagram and the gift, provided we radicalize it against Freud himself. Indeed, we must switch the targets of each of these three theories and turn Mauss against Mauss, Saussure against Saussure and Freud against Freud. The principle of reversibility, the counter-gift, must be imposed against all the economistic, psycholopage. 1. Page 2. Gistic and structuralist interpretations for which Mauss paved the way. The Saussure of the anagrams must be set against Saussurian linguistics, against even his own restricted hypotheses concerning the anagram. The Freud of the death drive must be pitched against every previous psychoanalytic edifice, and even against Freud's version of the death drive. At the price of paradox and theoretical violence, we witness that the three hypotheses describe, in their own respective fields, but this propriety is precisely what the general form of the symbolic annihilates, a functional principle, sovereignly outside and antagonistic to our economic reality principle. Everywhere, in every domain, a single form predominates, reversibility, cyclical reversal and annulment put an end to the linearity of time, language, economic exchange, accumulation, and power. Hence the reversibility of the gift in the counter-gift, the reversibility of exchange in the sacrifice, the reversibility of time in the cycle, the reversibility of production in destruction, the reversibility of life in death, and the reversibility of every term and value of the long gin. The anagram. In every domain it assumes the form of extermination and death, for it is the form of the symbolic itself. Neither mystical nor structural, the symbolic is inevitable. The reality principle corresponded to a certain stage of the law of value. Today the whole system is swamped by indeterminacy, and every reality is absorbed by the hyper-reality of the code and simulation. The principle of simulation governs us now, rather than the outdated reality principle. We feed on those forms whose finalities have disappeared. No more ideology, only simulacra. We must therefore reconstruct the entire genealogy of the law of value and its simulacra, in order to grasp the hegemony and the enchantment of the current system. A structural revolution of value. This genealogy must cover political economy, where it will appear as a second-order simulacrum, just like all those that stake everything on the real of production, the real of signification, whether conscious or unconscious. Capital no longer belongs to the order of political economy, it operates with political economy as its simulated model. The entire apparatus of the commodity law of value is absorbed and recycled in the larger apparatus of the structural law of value, thus becoming part of the third order of simulacra, see below. Political economy is thus assured a second life, an eternity, within the confines of an apparatus in which it has lost all its strict determinacy, but maintains an effective Presence as a system of reference for simulation. It was exactly the same for the previous apparatus, the natural law of value, which the system of political economy and the market law of value also appropriated as their imaginary system of reference. Nature leads a ghostly existence as use value at the core of exchange value. But on the next twist of the spiral, use value is seized as an alibi within the dominant order of the code. Each configuration of value is seized by the next in a higher order of simulacra. End. Page 2. Page 3. Each phase of value integrates the prior apparatus into its own as a phantom reference, a puppet reference, a simulated reference. A revolution separates each order from its successor. These are the only genuine revolutions. We are in the third order, which is the order no longer of the real, but of the hyper-real. It is only here that theories and practices, themselves floating and indeterminate, can reach the real and beat it to death. Contemporary revolutions are indexed on the immediately prior state of the system. They are all buttressed by a nostalgia for the resurrection of the real in all its forms, that is, as second-order simulacra, dialectics, use value, the transparency and finality of production, the liberation of the unconscious, of repressed meaning, the signifier, or the signified named desire, and so on. All these liberations provide the ideal content for the system to devour in its successive revolutions, and which it brings subtly back to life as mere phantasmas of revolution. These revolutions are only transitions towards generalized manipulation. At the stage of the aleatory processes of control, even revolution becomes meaningless. The rational, referential, historical, and functional machines of consciousness correspond to industrial machines. They aleatory, non-referential, transferential, indeterminate, and floating machines of the unconscious respond to the aleatory machines of the code. But even the unconscious is reabsorbed by this operation, and it has long since lost its own reality principle to become an operational simulacrum. At the precise point that its psychical reality principle merges into its psychoanalytic reality principle, the unconscious, like political economy, also becomes a model of simulation. The systemic strategy is merely to invoke a number of floating values in this hyper-reality. This is as true of the unconscious as it is of money and theories. Value rules according to the indiscernible order of generation by means of models, according to the infinite chains of simulation. Cybernetic operativity, the genetic code, the aleatory order of mutation, the uncertainty principle, etc., succeed. Determinate, objectivist science, and the dialectical view of history and consciousness. Even critical theory, along with the revolution, turns into a second-order simulacrum, as do all determinate processes. The deployment of third-order simulacra sweeps all this away, and to attempt to reinstate dialectics, objective contradictions, and so on, against them, would be a futile political regression. You can't fight the aleatory by imposing finalities, you can't fight against programmed and molecular dispersion with prizes de conscience and dialectical sublation, you can't fight the code with political economy, nor with revolution. All these outdated weapons, including those we find in first-order simulacra, in the ethics and metaphysics of man and nature, use value, and other liberatory systems of reference, are gradually neutralized by a higher-order general system. Everything that filters into the non-finality of the space-time of the code, or that attempts to intervene in it, is page 3. Page 4. Disconnected from its own ends, disintegrated and absorbed. This is the well-known effect of recuperation, manipulation, of circulating and recycling at every level. All dissent must be of a higher logical type than that to which it is opposed. Anthony, Wilden, System and Structure, London, Tavistock, 1977, PXXVII. Is it at least possible to find an even match to oppose third-order simulacra? Is there a theory or a practice which is subversive because it is more aleatory than the system itself, an indeterminate subversion which would be to the order of the code what the revolution was to the order of political economy? Can we fight DNA? Certainly not by means of the class struggle. Perhaps simulacra of a higher logical, or illogical, order could be invented, beyond the current third order, beyond determinacy and indeterminacy. But would they still be simulacra? Perhaps death and death alone, the reversibility of death, belongs to a higher order than the code. Only symbolic disorder can bring about an interruption in the code. Every system that approaches perfect operativity simultaneously approaches its downfall. When the system says A is A, or 2 times 2 equals 4, it approaches absolute power and total absurdity, that is, immediate and probable subversion. A gentle push in the right place is enough to bring it crashing down. We know the potential of tautology. When it reinforces the system's claim to perfect sphericity, ubu rois belli. Identity is untenable, it is death, since it fails to inscribe its own death. Every closed or metastable, functional or cybernetic system is shadowed by mockery and instantaneous subversion, which no longer takes the detour through long dialectical labor, because all the system's inertia acts against it. Ambivalence awaits the most advanced systems, that, like Leibniz's binary God, have deified their functional principle. The fascination they exert, because it derives from a profound denial such as we find in fetishism, can be instantaneously reversed. Hence their fragility increases in proportion to their ideal coherence. These systems, even when they are based on radical indeterminacy, the loss of meaning, fall prey, once more, to meaning. They collapse under the weight of their own monstrosity, like fossilized dinosaurs, and immediately decompose. This is the fatality of every system committed by its own logic to total perfection, and therefore to a total defectiveness, to absolute infallibility and therefore irrevocable breakdown, the aim of all bound energies is their own death. This is why the only strategy is catastrophic, and not dialectical at all. Things must be pushed to the limit, where quite naturally they collapse and are inverted. At the peak of value we are closest to ambivalence, at the pinnacle of coherence we are closest to the abyss of corruption which haunts the reduplicated signs of the code. Simulation must go further than the system. Death must be played against death, a radical tautology that makes the system's own logic the ultimate weapon. The only strategy against the hyper-realist system is some form of pataphysics, a science of imaginary solutions, that is, a science fiction of the system's reversal against itself. Page 4. Page 5. The extreme limit of simulation, a reversible simulation in a hyperlogic of death and destruction. 1. The symbolic demands meticulous reversibility. Exterminate every term, abolish value in the term's revolution against itself, that is the only symbolic violence equivalent to and triumphant over the structural violence of the code. A revolutionary dialectic corresponded to the commodity law of value and its equivalents, only the scrupulous reversion of death corresponds to the code's indeterminacy and the structural law of value. Point 2. Strictly speaking, nothing remains for us to base anything on. All that remains for us is theoretical violence speculation to the death, whose only method is the radicalization of hypotheses. Even the code and the symbolic remain terms of simulation, it must be possible to extract them, one by one, from discourse. Notes. 1. Death is always equally what waits at the term of the system, and the symbolic extermination that stalks the system itself. It is not that there are two words to designate the finality of death internal to the system, the one inscribed everywhere in its operational logic, and the other a radical counter-finality inscribed on the system as such, but which haunts it everywhere, only the term of death, and it alone, figures on both sides. This ambiguity can already be discerned in the Freudian death drive. Rather than an ambiguity, however, it simply translates the proximity of complete perfection, an immediate defectiveness. Death ought never to be understood as the real event that affects a subject or a body, but as a form in which the determinacy of the subject and of value is lost. The demand of reversibility puts an end to determinacy and indeterminacy at the same time. It puts an end to bound energies and stable oppositions, and is therefore in substantial agreement with theories of flows and intensities, whether libidinal or schizo. The unbinding of energies is, however, the very form of the current system, which consists in a strategic drift of value. The system can be connected and disconnected, but all the freed energies will one day return to it. This is how the concepts of energy and intensity come about. Capital is an energetic and intense system. Hence the impossibility of distinguishing the libidinal economy from the political economy. See Jean-François Lyotard, Libidinal Economy Trih. Grant, London, Athlone, 1992, of the System of Value, and the impossibility of distinguishing capitalist schizoes from revolutionary schizoes. See Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia ITRR Hurley, M. Seam and H.R. Lane. London, Athlone, 1984. For the system is master, like God it can bind or unbind energies, what it is incapable of, and what it can no longer avoid, is reversibility. Reversibility alone therefore, rather than unbinding or drifting, is fatal to it. This is exactly what the term symbolic exchange means. Page 5. Page 6. Part 1. The end of production. The structural revolution of value. Saussure located two dimensions to the exchange of terms of the langue, which he assimilated to money. A given coin must be exchangeable against a real good of some value, while on the other hand it must be possible to relate it to all the other terms in the monetary system. More and more, Saussure reserves the term value for this second aspect of the system. Every term can be related to every other, their relativity, internal to the system and constituted by binary oppositions. This definition is opposed to the other possible definition of value, the relation of every term to what it designates, of each signifier to its signified, like the relation of every coin with what it can be exchanged against. The first aspect corresponds to the structural dimension of language, the second to its functional dimension. Each dimension is separate but linked, which is to say that they mesh and cohere. This coherence is characteristic of the classical configuration of the linguistic sign, under the rule of the commodity law of value, where designation always appears as the finality of the structural operation of the langue. The parallel between this classical stage of signification and the mechanics of value in material production is absolute, as in Marx's analysis, use value plays the role of the horizon and finality of the system of exchange values. The first qualifies the concrete operation of the commodity in consumption, a moment parallel to designation in the sign. The second relates to the exchangeability of any commodity for any other. Under the law of equivalence, a moment parallel to the structural organization of the sign. Both are dialectically linked. Throughout Marx's analyses and define a rational configuration of production, governed by political economy. A revolution has put an end to this classical economics of value, a revolution of value itself, which carries value beyond its commodity form into its radical form. This revolution consists in the dislocation of the two aspects of the law of value, which were thought to be coherent and eternally bound as if by a natural law. Referential value is annihilated, giving the structural play of value the upper hand. The structural dimension becomes autonomous by excluding the referential dimension, and is instituted upon the death of reference. The systems of reference for production, signification, the affect, substance, and history, all this equivalence to a real content. Page 6. Page 7. Loading the sign with the burden of utility, with gravity its form of representative equivalence, all this is over with. Now, the other stage of value has the upper hand, a total relativity, general commutation, combination and simulation, in the sense that, from now on, signs are exchanged against each other rather than against the real. It is not that they just happen to be exchanged against each other, they do so on condition that they are no longer exchanged against the real. The emancipation of the sign, remove this archaic obligation to designate something in it, finally becomes free, indifferent, and totally indeterminate, in the structural or combinatory play which succeeds the previous rule of determinate equivalence. The same operation takes place at the level of labor power and the production process. The annihilation of any goal as regards the contents of production allows the latter to function as a code, and the monetary sign, for example, to escape into infinite speculation, beyond all reference to a real of production, or even to a gold standard. The flotation of money and signs, the flotation of needs and ends of production, the flotation of labor itself, the commutability of every term is accompanied by speculation and a limitless inflation, and we really have total liberty, no duties, disaffection, and general disenchantment, but this remains a magic, a sort of magical obligation which keeps the sign chained up to the real. Capital has freed signs from this novelty in order to deliver them into pure circulation. Neither Saussure nor Marx had any presentiment of all this. They were still in the golden age of the dialectic of the sign and the real, which is at the same time the classical period of capital and value. Their dialectic is in shreds, and the real has died of the shock of value acquiring this fantastic autonomy. Determinacy is dead, indeterminacy holds sway. There has been an extermination, in the literal sense of the word, of the real of production and the real of signification. 1. I indicated this structural revolution of the law of value in the term political economy of the sign. Point 2. This term, however, can only be regarded as makeshift, for the following reasons. 1. Does this remain a political economic question? Yes, in that it is always a question of value and the law of value. However, the mutation that affects it is so profound and so decisive, the content of political economy so thoroughly changed, indeed annihilated, that the term is nothing more than an illusion. Moreover, it is precisely political to the extent that it is always the destruction of social relations governed by the relevant value. For a long time, however, it has been a matter of something entirely different from economics. 2. The term sign has itself only an elusive value. Since the structural law of value affects signification as much as it does everything else, its form is not that of the sign in general, but that of a certain organization which is that of the code. The code only governs certain signs, however. Just as the commodity law of value does not, at a given moment, signify just any determinate instance of material production, neither, conversely, does the Page 7. Page 8. Structural law of value signify any preeminence of the sign whatever. This illusion derives from the fact that Marx developed the one in the shadow of the commodity, while Saussure developed the other in the shadow of the linguistic sign. But this illusion must be shattered. The commodity law of value is a law of equivalences, and this law operates throughout every sphere. It equally designates the equivalence in the configuration of the sign, where one signifier and one signified facilitate the regulated exchange of a referential content, the other parallel modality being the linearity of the signifier, contemporaneous with the linear and cumulative time of production. The classical law of value then operates simultaneously in every instance, language, production, etc., despite these latter remaining distinct according to their sphere of reference. Conversely, the structural law of value signifies the indeterminacy of every sphere in relation to every other, and to their Proper content, also therefore the passage from the determinate sphere of signs to the indeterminacy of the code. To say that the sphere of material production and that of signs exchange their respective contents is still too wide of the mark. They literally disappear as such and lose their specificity along with their determinacy, to the benefit of a form of value. Of a much more general assemblage, where designation and production are annihilated. The political economy of the sign was also consequent upon an extension of the commodity law of value in its confirmation at the level of signs, whereas the structural configuration of value simply and simultaneously puts an end to the regimes of production, political economy, representation, and signs. With the code, all this collapses into simulation. Strictly speaking, neither the classical economy nor the political economy of the sign ceases to exist, they lead a secondary existence, becoming a sort of phantom principle of dissuasion. The end of labor. The end of production. The end of political economy. The end of the signifier/signified dialectic, which facilitates the accumulation of knowledge and meaning, the linear syntagma of cumulative discourse. And at the same time, the end of the exchange value/use value dialectic, which is the only thing that makes accumulation and social production possible. The end of the linear dimension of discourse. The end of the linear dimension of the commodity. The end of the classical era of the sign. The end of the era of production. It is not the revolution which puts an end to all this, it is capital itself which abolishes the determination of the social. According to the means of production, substitutes the structural form for the commodity form of value, and currently controls every aspect of the system's strategy. This historical and social mutation is legible at every level. In this way the era of simulation is announced everywhere by the commutability of formerly contradictory or dialectically opposed terms. Everywhere we see the same genesis of simulacra, the commutability of the beautiful and the ugly in fashion, of the left and the right in politics, of the true and the false. Page 8. Page 9. In every media message, the useful and the useless at the level of objects, nature, and culture at every level of signification. All the great humanist criteria of value, the whole civilization of moral, aesthetic, and practical judgment, are effaced in our system of images and signs. Everything becomes undecidable, the characteristic effect of the domination of the code, which everywhere rests on the principle of neutralization, of indifference. 3. This is the generalized brothel of capital, a brothel not for prostitution, but for substitution and commutation. This process, which has for a long time been at work in culture, art, politics, and even in sexuality, in the so-called superstructural domains, today affects the economy itself, the whole so-called infrastructural field. Here the same indeterminacy holds sway. And, of course, with the loss of determination of the economic, we also lose any possibility of conceiving it as the determinant agency. Since for 2 centuries historical determination has been built up around the economic, since Marx in any case, it is there that it is important to grasp the interruption of the code. The end of production. We are at the end of production. In the West, this form coincides with the proclamation of the commodity law of value. That is to say, with the reign of political economy. First, nothing is produced, strictly speaking, everything is deduced from the grace, God, or beneficence, nature, of an agency which releases or withholds its riches. Value emanates from the reign of divine or natural qualities, which for us have become retrospectively confused. The physiocrats still saw the cycles of land and labor in this way, as having no value of their own. We may wonder, then, whether there is a genuine law of value, since this law is dispatch without attaining rational expression. Its form cannot be separated from the inexhaustible referential substance to which it is bound. If there is a law here, it is, in contrast to the commodity law, a Natural law of value. A mutation shakes this edifice of a natural distribution or dispensing of wealth as soon as value is produced, as its reference becomes labor, and its law of equivalence is generalized to every type of labor. Value is now assigned to the distinct and rational operation of human, social, labor. It is measurable, and, in consequence, so is surplus value. The critique of political economy begins with social production or the mode of production as its reference. The concept of production alone allows us, by means of an analysis of that unique commodity called labor power, to extract a surplus value, which controls the rational dynamics of capital as well as its beyond, the revolution. Today everything has changed again. Production, the commodity form, labor power, equivalence, and surplus value, which together formed the outline of a quantitative, material, and measurable configuration, are now things of the past. Productive forces outlined another reference which, page 9, page 10, although in contradiction with the relations of production, remained a reference, that of social wealth. An aspect of production still supports both a social form called capital and its internal critique called Marxism. Now, revolutionary demands are based on the abolition of the commodity law of value. Now we have passed from the commodity law of value to the structural law of value, and this coincides with the obliteration of the social form known as production. Given this, are we still within a capitalist mode? It may be that we are in a hyper-capitalist mode, or in a very different order. Is the form of capital bound to the law of value in general, or to some specific form of the law of value? Perhaps we are really already within a socialist mode? Perhaps this metamorphosis of capital under the sign of the structural law of value is merely its socialist outcome? Oh dear! If the life and death of capital are staked on the commodity law of value, if the revolution is staked on the mode of production, then we are within neither capital nor revolution. If this latter consists in a liberation of the social and generic production of man, then there is no longer any prospect of a revolution since there is no more production. If, on the other hand, capital is a mode of domination, then we are always in its midst. This is because the structural law of value is the purest, most illegible form of social domination, like surplus value. It no longer has any references within a dominant class or a relation of forces, it works without violence, entirely reabsorbed without any trace of bloodshed into the signs which surround us, operative everywhere in the code in which capital finally holds its purest discourses, beyond the dialects of industry, trade, and finance, beyond the dialects of class which it held in its productive phase a symbolic violence inscribed everywhere in signs, even in the signs of the revolution. The structural revolution of value eliminated the basis of the revolution. The loss of reference fatally affected first the revolutionary systems of reference, which can no longer be found in any social substance of production, nor in the certainty of a reversal in any truth of labor power. This is because labor is not a power, it has become one sign amongst many. Like every other sign, it produces and consumes itself. It is exchanged against non-labor, leisure, in accordance with a total equivalence, it is commutable with every other sector of everyday life. No more or less alienated, it is no longer a unique, historical praxis giving rise to unique social relations. Like most practices, it is now only a set of signing operations. It becomes part of contemporary life in general, that is, it is framed by signs. It is no longer even the suffering of historical prostitution which used to play the role of the contrary promise of final emancipation, or, as in Lyotard, as the space of the worker's enjoyment jouissance which fulfills an unremitting desire. In the abjection of value and the rule of capital. For none of this remains true. Sign form seizes labor and rids it of every historical or libidinal significance, and absorbs it in the process of its own reproduction, the operation of the sign, behind. The empty allusion to. Page 10. Page 11. What it designates, is to replicate itself. In the past, labor was used to designate the reality of a social production and a social objective of accumulating wealth. Even capital and surplus value exploited it precisely where it retained a use of value. For the expanded reproduction of capital and its final destruction. It was shot through with finality anyway if the worker is absorbed in the pure and simple reproduction of his labor power. It is not true that the process of production is experienced as senseless repetition. Labor revolutionizes society through its very abjection, as a commodity whose potential always exceeds pure and simple reproduction of value. Today this is no longer the case since labor is no longer productive but has become reproductive of the assignation to labor, which is the general habit of a society which no longer knows whether or not it wishes to produce. No more myths of production and no more contents of production. National balance sheets now merely retrace a numerical and statistical growth devoid of meaning, an inflation of the science of accountancy over which we can no longer even project the fantasy of the collective will. The pathos of growth itself is dead, since no one believes any longer in the pathos of production, whose final, paranoid and panic-stricken tumescence it was. Today these codes are detumescent. It remains, however, more necessary than ever to reproduce labor as a social ritual affectation, as a reflex, as morality, as consensus, as regulation, as the reality principle. The reality principle of the code, that is, an immense ritual of the signs of labor extends over society in general since it reproduces itself. It matters little whether or not it produces. It is much more effective to socialize by means of rituals and signs than by the bound energies of production. You are asked only to become socialized, not to produce or to excel yourself. This classical ethic now arouses suspicion instead. You are asked only to consider value, according to the structural definition which here takes on its full social significance, as one term. In relation to others, to function as a sign in the general scenario of production, just as labor and production now function only as signs, as terms commutable with non-labor, consumption, communication, etc. A multiple, incessant, twisting relation across the entire network of other signs. Labor, once voided of its energy and substance, and generally disinvested, is given a new role as the model of social simulation, bringing all the other categories along with it into the aleatory sphere of the code. An unervingly strange state of affairs, this sudden plunge into a sort of secondary existence, separated from you by all the opacity of a previous life, where there was a familiarity and an intimacy in the traditional process of labor. Even the concrete reality of exploitation, the violent sociality of labor, is familiar. This has all gone now, and is due not so much to the operative abstraction of the process of labor, so often described, as to the passage of every signification of labor into an operational field where it becomes a floating variable, dragging the whole imaginary of a previous life along with it. Page 11. Page 12. Beyond the autonomization of production as mode, beyond the convulsions, contradictions, and revolutions inherent in the mode, the code of production must re-emerge. This is the dimension things are taking on today, at the end of a materialist history which has succeeded in authenticating it as the real movement of society. Art, religion, and duty have no real history. For Marx, only production has a history, or, rather, it is history, it grounds history. An incredible fabrication of labor and production as historical reason and, the generic model of fulfillment. The end of this religious autonomization of production allows us to see that all of this could equally have been produced. This time in the sense of a stage production in a scenario, fairly recently, with totally different goals than the internal finalities, that is, the revolution, secreted away within production. To analyze production as a code cuts across both the material evidence of machines, factories, labor time, the product, salaries and money, and the more formal, but equally objective, evidence of surplus value, the market, capital, to discover the rule of the game, which is to destroy the logical network of the agencies of capital, and even the critical network of the Marxian categories which analyze it, which categories are again only an appearance at the second degree of capital, its critical appearance, in order to discover the elementary signifiers of production, the social relations it establishes, buried away forever beneath the historical illusion of the producers, and the theoreticians. Labor. Labor power is not a power, it is a definition, an axiom, and its real operation in the labor process, its use value, is only the reduplication of this definition in the operation of the code. It is at the level of the sign, never at the level of energy, that violence is fundamental. The mechanism of capital, and not its law, plays on surplus value the non-cover equivalence of the salary and labor power. Even if the two were equivalent, even if salaries were abolished, for the sale of labor power, man would still be marked by this axiom, by this destiny of production, by this sacrament of labor, which sets him apart like a sex. The worker is no longer a man, nor even a woman, it has its own sex, it is assigned this labor power as an end, and marked by it as a woman is marked by her sex, her sexual definition, as a black is by the color of his or her skin, all signs and nothing but signs. We must distinguish what belongs to the mode and what belongs to the code of production. Before becoming an element of the commodity law of value, labor power is initially a status, a structure of obedience to a code. Before becoming exchange value or use value, it is already, like any other commodity, the sign of the operation of nature as value, which defines production and is the basic axiom of our culture and no other. This message, much more profoundly than quantitative equivalences, runs. Page 12. Page 13. Beneath commodities from the outset, to remove indeterminacy from nature, and man, in order to submit it to the determinacy of value. This is confirmed in the constructionist mania for bulldozers, motorways, infrastructures, and in the civilizing mania of the era of production, a mania for leaving no fragment unproduced, for countersigning everything with production, without even the hope of an excess of wealth. Producing in order to mark, producing in order to reproduce the marked man. What is production today apart from this terrorism of the code? This is as clear for us as it was for the first industrial generations, who dealt with machines as with an absolute enemy, harbingers of total destructuration, before the comforting dream of a historical dialectic of production developed. The Luddite practices, which arose everywhere to some extent, the savagery of attacking the instrument of production, primarily attacking itself as the productive force, endemic sabotage and defection bear lengthy testimony to the fragility of the productive order. Smashing machines is an aberrant act if they are the means of production, if any ambiguity remains over their future use of value. If, however, the ends of this production collapse, then the respect due to the means of production also collapses. And the machines appear as their true end, as direct and immediate operational signs of the social relation to death on which capital is nourished. Nothing then stands in the way of their destruction. In this sense, the Luddites were much clearer than Marx on the impact of the eruption of the industrial order, and today, at the catastrophic end of this process, to which Marx himself has misled us in the dialectical euphoria of productive forces, they have in some sense exacted their revenge. We do not mean to invoke the prestige that may attach to a particular type of labor when we say that labor is a sign, nor even the sense of improvement signified by wage labor for the Algerian immigrant in relation to his tribal community, or for the Moroccan kid from the high Atlas Mountains whose only dream is to work for Simca, or for women in our own society. In this case, labor refers to a strict value, betterment or a different status. On the contemporary stage, labor no longer emerges from this referential definition of the sign. There is no longer any proper signification of a particular type of labor or of labor in general, but a system of labor where jobs are exchanged. No more right man in the right place. 5. An old adage of the scientific idealism of production. There are no more interchangeable but indispensable individuals in a determinate labor process, since the labor process itself has become interchangeable, mobile, polyvalent, and intermittent structures of absorption, indifferent to every object and even to labor itself, when understood according to its classical operation and applied solely to localize each individual within a social nexus where nothing converges except perhaps within the immanence of this operational matrix, an indifferent paradigm which identifies every individual according to a shared radical, or a syntagma which links them into an indefinite combinatory mode. Labor, even in the guise of leisure, like a primary repression, pervades. Page 13. Page 14. Every aspect of life in the form of a control, a permanent occupation of spaces and times regulated according to an omnipresent code. Wherever there are people, they must be fixed, whether in schools, factories, on the beach, in front of the TV, or being retrained. Generalized and permanent mobilization. Such labor is not, however, productive in the sense of original. It is nothing more than the mirror of society, its imaginary, its fantastic reality principle. Perhaps its death drive. This is the tendency of every current strategy that turns around labor, job enrichment, 6 flexitime, mobility, retraining, continuing education, autonomy, worker management, decentralization of the labor process, even the Californian utopia of domestic cybernetics. Your quotidian roots are no longer savagely ripped up in order to hand you over to the machine. Your childhood, your habits, your relationships, your unconscious drives, and even your refusal to work are integrated into it. You will easily find a place for yourself amongst all of this, a personalized job, or, failing that, there is a welfare provision calculated according to your personal needs. In any case, you will no longer be abandoned, since it is essential that everyone be a terminal for the entire system, an insignificant terminal, but a term nonetheless, not an inarticulate cry, but a term of the long and at the terminus of the entire structural network of the language. The very choice of work, the utopia of a tailor-made job, signifies that the die is cast, that the structure of absorption is total. Labor power is no longer brutally bought and sold, it is designed, marketed, and turned into a commodity. Production re-enters the sign system of consumption. An initial step of this analysis was to conceive the sphere of consumption as an extension of the sphere of the forces of production. We must now do the reverse. The entire sphere of production, labor, and the forces of production must be conceived as collapsing into the sphere of consumption, understood as the sphere of a generalized axiomatic, a coded exchange of signs, a general lifestyle. In this way knowledge, the sciences, attitudes, devoirs, les discours du capitalisme Paris, L. Hearn, 1971, p. 36, why not consider the attitudes of the workforce as one of the resources to be managed by the boss, but also sexuality and the body, the imagination, Ibid, p. 74, the imagination is all that remains bound to the pleasure principle, whereas the psychical apparatus is subordinated to the reality principle, Freud. We must put a stop to this waste. The imagination should be realized as a force of production, it should be invested. The slogan of technocracy is, power to the imagination. The same goes for the unconscious, the revolution, and so on. True, all this is in the process of being invested and absorbed into the sphere of value, but not so much market value as accountable value, that is, it is not mobilized for the sake of production, but indexed, allocated, summoned to play the part of a functional variable. It has become not so much a force of production as several pieces on the chessboard of the code, caught in the same game rules. The axiom of production now tends to be reduced to factors. The axiom of the code reduces everything to a variable. One leads. Page 14. Page 15. To equations and balance sheets of forces, and the other tends towards mobile and aleatory sets, which neutralize whatever escapes or resists them by connection and not by annexation. This goes much further than Taylorism, or the scientific organization of labor, soul, but its specter marks an essential milestone of investment by the code. Two phases can be distinguished. The pre-scientific phase of the industrial system, characterized by maximum exploitation of labor power, is succeeded by the phase of machinery and the preponderance of fixed capital, where objectified labor appears not only in the form of product, or of the product employed as the means of labor, but in the form of the force of production itself. Marx. Grundrisse Tr. Martin Nicholas, Harmonsworth, Penguin, 1973, p. 694. This accumulation of objectified labor which supplants living labor as a force of production is subsequently multiplied to infinity by the accumulation of knowledge. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus absorbed into capital, as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital, Ibid, p. 694. In the phase of machinery, the scientific apparatus, the collective laborer and the soul, the production process has ceased to be a labor process in the sense of a process dominated by labor as its governing unity, Ibid, p. 693. There is no longer any original force of production, only a general machinery transforming the forces of production into capital. Or, rather, a machinery which manufactures both the force of production and labor power. The whole social apparatus of labor is forestalled by this operation. The collective machinery has begun to produce social goals directly, and this is what produces production. The hegemony of dead labor over living labor. Primitive accumulation merely accumulates dead labor to the point that it can reabsorb living labor. Or, in other words, it becomes capable of controlling the production of living labor for its own ends. This is why the end of primitive accumulation marks the decisive turning point of political economy. They transition to the preponderance of dead labor, to crystallized social relations incarnated in dead labor, weighing down on society in its entirety as the code of domination itself. Marx's greatest error was to have retained a belief in the innocence of machines, the technical process and science, all of which were supposedly capable of becoming living social labor once the system of capital was liquidated, despite the fact that this is precisely what the system is based on. This pious hope springs from having underestimated death in dead labor, and from thinking that death is overcome in the living, beyond a certain crucial point, by a sort of historical somersault of production. Marx had, however, sensed this while noting that objectified labor confronts living labor within the process itself as the power which rules it, a power which, as the appropriation of living labor, is the form of capital. Grundrisse, p. 693. J.B.'s emphasis. This also becomes apparent in the page 15. Page 16. Formula according to which, at a certain stage of capital, man steps to the side of the production process, instead of being its chief actor. Ibid, p. 705. This formula goes well beyond political economy and its critique, since it literally signifies that it is a matter no longer of a production process, but of a process of exclusion and relegation. We must again draw out all the consequences of this. When production attains this circularity and turns in on itself, it loses every objective determination. It incants itself as myth while its own terms have become signs. Simultaneously, when this sphere of signs, including the media, information, etc., ceases to be a specific sphere for representing the unity of the global process of capital, then we must not only say with Marx that the production process has ceased to be a labor process, Ibid, p. 693, but that the process of capital itself has ceased to be a production process. With the hegemony of dead labor over living labor, the whole dialectic of production collapses. Following the same basic schema as the central oppositions of rationalist thought, truth and falsity, appearance and reality, nature and culture, all the oppositions according to which Marxism operates, use value/exchange value, forces of production/relations of production, are also neutralized, and in the same way, everything within production and the economy becomes commutable, reversible, and exchangeable according to the same indeterminate specularity as we find in politics, fashion, or the media. The indeterminate specularity of the forces and relations of production, of capital and labor, use value and exchange value, constitutes the dissolution of production into the code. Today the law of value no longer lies so much in the exchangeability of every commodity under the sign of a general equivalent, as it does in a much more radical exchangeability of all the categories of political economy, and its critique, in accordance with the code. All the determinations of bourgeois thought were neutralized and abolished by the materialist thought of production, which has brought everything down to a single great historical determination. In its turn, however, this too is neutralized and absorbed by a revolution of the terms of the system. Just as other generations were able to dream of pre-capitalist society, we have begun to dream of political economy as a lost object. Now, even its discourse carries some referential force only because it is a lost object. Marx. On the whole, types of work that are consumed as services and not as products separable from the worker, hence not capable of existing as commodities independently of him, are of microscopic significance when compared with the mass of capitalist production. They may be entirely neglected, therefore, and can be dealt with under the category of wage labor. Capital Tr. Ben Fowkes, Harmonsworth, Penguin, 1976, Volume 1, pages 10445. This chapter of Capital was never written. The problem posed by this disjunction, which confirms that between productive and unproductive labor, is utterly insoluble. Every Marxist definition of labor is split, but page 16. Page 17. This was happening from the outset. In the Grundriss, Marx says, labor becomes productive only by producing its own opposite, that is, capital, p. 305n, from which we may logically conclude that if labor comes to reproduce itself, as is the case today within the compass of the collective laborer, it ceases to be productive. This is the unforeseen consequence of a definition which did not even consider that capital might take root in something other than the productive, precisely, perhaps, in labor voided of its productivity, in unproductive labor, somehow neutralized, where capital simply eludes the dangerous determinacy of productive labor and can begin to establish its total domination. By misunderstanding unproductive labor, Marx concedes the real undefined character of labor on which the strategy of capital is based. Production for unproductive consumption is quite as productive as that for productive consumption, always assuming that it produces or reproduces capital. Grundriss, p. 306n. According to Marx's own definition, there is a paradox here, which results from an increasing sector of human labor becoming unproductive without apparently preventing capital from consolidating its dominance. In fact, however, this is all rigged in advance. There are not 2 or 3 types of labor. 7 Capital itself whispered these pedantic distinctions to Marx, while never being stupid enough to believe in them itself, always merely naively overlooking them. There is only one sort of labor, a fundamental definition in fact, and as luck would have it, this is the one that Marx let slip through his fingers. Today all labor falls under a single definition. That bastard, archaic and unanalyzed category of service labor, and not the supposedly universal classical definition of proletarian wage labor. This is not service labor in the feudal sense, since labor has lost the sense of obligation and reciprocity that it had in the feudal context, but in the sense that Marx indicates, in service, prestation is inseparable from the prestator, an archaic aspect in the productivist vision of capital, but one that's fundamental if capital is grasped as a system of domination, as a system of infeudation to a laboring society, that is, to a certain type of political society for which labor is the rule of the game. This is where we are, if we weren't already there in Marx's time. The reduction of every labor to a service labor as pure and simple presence/occupation, consumption of time, prestation of time. We make an act of labor as we make an act of presence or an act of allegiance. In this sense, prestation is in fact inseparable from the prestator. The service rendered conjoins the body, time, space, and grey matter. Whether this produces or not is a matter of indifference. As regards this personal indexation, surplus value disappears, of course, and the meaning of wages changes. We will come back to this later. It is not, however, a regression of capital towards feudalism, but rather the dawn of its real domination, solicitation, and total conscription of the person. This is the tendency of every effort to rid totalis labor, making it into a total service where the prestator may be more or less absent, but increasingly personally involved. Page 17. Page 18. In this sense, labor can no longer be distinguished from other activities, particularly from its opposing term of free time, which, because it implies the same mobilization and the same investment, or the same productive disinvestment, is today just as much a service rendered, which, in accordance with any standard of justice, should merit a wage. This is not absolutely impossible. Point 9. In short, it is not only the imaginary distinction between productive and unproductive labor which is shaken up, but also the distinction between work and rest itself. There is quite simply no more labor in the specific sense of the term, so Marx ultimately did well not to write his chapter of Capital. It was condemned from the outset. It is at precisely this moment that workers become agents of production. This slippage of terminology, such things have their own importance, ironically signifies the status of one who produces nothing. The semi-skilled worker was no longer a laborer, but merely a worker facing the total indifferentiation of labor, no longer struggling over the content of labor, nor over specific wages, but struggling over the generalized form of labor and the political wage. The formation of the agent of production is accompanied by his liberation from the most abstract form, much more abstract than the old semi-skilled worker, exploited to death. The mannequin of labor appeared, the lowest common denominator, the dumb waiter of labor's unreality principle. A pleasant euphemism: we no longer work, but merely perform acts of production. This is the end of production culture, hence the a contrario appearance of the term productive. This productive agent is no longer characterized by its exploitation, nor by its being raw material in a labor process. It is characterized by its mobility and interchangeability, by being an insignificant inflection of fixed capital. The agent of production designates the ultimate status of Marx's worker who, as he said, steps to the side of the production process. The current phase, where the process of capital itself ceases to be a process of production, is simultaneously the phase of The disappearance of the factory, society as a whole takes on the appearance of a factory. The factory must disappear as such, and labor must lose its specificity in order that capital can ensure the extensive metamorphosis of its form throughout society as a whole. We must therefore formally recognize the disappearance of the determinate sites of labor, a determinate subject of labor, a determinate time of social labor. We must formally recognize the disappearance of the factory, labor, and the proletariat if we want to analyze capital's current and real dominance. Point 10. The chain store stage of society, or the factory superstructure, the virtual reserve army of capital, is at an end. The principle of the factory and labor explodes and scatters over every aspect of society in such a way that the distinction between the two becomes ideological. It becomes one of capital's traps for maintaining the factory's specific and privileged presence in the revolutionary imaginary. Labor is everywhere, because there is no more labor. Labor now reaches its definitive, completed form, its principle, which supports end. Page 18. Page 19. Confirms the principles elaborated in the course of history in those other social spaces that preceded manufacturing, industry, and served as a model for it: the asylum, the ghetto, the general hospital, the prison, all the sites of enclosure and concentration that our culture has hidden in its march to civilization. Today, all these determinate sites are themselves losing even their own limits. They are spread throughout global society since the asylum form, carceral form, and discrimination have begun to invest the whole social space, every moment of real life. 11. All these things, factories, asylums, prisons, schools, still exist, and will no doubt continue to exist for an indefinite period, as warning signs, to divert the reality of the domination of capital into an imaginary materiality. There have always been churches to hide the death of God, or to hide the fact that God was everywhere, which amounts to the same thing. There will always be animal reserves and Indian reservations to hide the fact that they are dead, and that we are all Indians. There will always be factories to hide the death of labor, the death of production, or the fact that they are everywhere and nowhere at once. For there is nothing with which to fight capital today in determinate forms. On the contrary, should it become clear that capital is no longer determined by something or other, and that its secret weapon is the reproduction of labor as imaginary, then capital itself would be close to exhaustion. Wages. Labor, which in its completed form has no relation to any determinate production, is also without any equivalent in wages. Wages are equivalent to labor power only from the perspective of the quantitative reproduction of labor power. When they become the sanction of the status of labor power, the sign of obedience to the rule of the game of capital, wages no longer possess any such meaning. They are no longer in any proportional or equivalence relation at all. 12. They are a sacrament, like a baptism, or the extreme unction, which turns you into a genuine citizen of the political society of capital. Beyond the economic investment which constitutes the worker's wage revenue for capital, end of the salariat as exploitation, beginning of the salariat as the actionariat of capitalist society, the worker's strategic function slides towards consumption as obligatory social service. It is the other sense of the term investment which brings it into the current phase of wage status. Capital invested the worker with a wage just as one used to be invested with a charge or a responsibility. But capital also invested the worker as one might invest a town, totally occupying it and controlling all access. Point 13. It is not solely by means of wage revenue that capital charges producers to keep money in circulation and thus to become real reproducers of capital, but more fundamentally by means of the wage status by which they are turned into purchasers of goods, in the same way that capital itself is the purchaser of labor. Every user uses consumer objects reduced to the page 19. Page 20. Functional status of the production of services, just as capital uses labor power. Everyone is thus invested with the Fundamental mentality of capital. On the other hand, as soon as wages are detached from labor power, nothing, not even the unions, stands in the way of an unlimited and maximal wage demand. If there is a right price for a certain quantity of labor force, a price can no longer be fixed on consensus and global participation. The traditional wage demand is only a negotiation over the producer's conditions. The maximalist demand is an offensive form of the wage earner's reversal of his status as a reproducer, a status to which he is condemned by means of the wage. It is a challenge. The wage earner wants everything. His method is not only to aggravate the economic crisis of the system but to turn every political constraint that the system imposes against it. The maximalist slogan runs, "Maximum wage for minimum labor." The political result of this escalating reversal might indeed be to send the system into orbit, in accordance with its own logic of labor as enforced presence. For wage earners operate no longer as producers, but rather in terms of non-production, a role assigned them by capital. Neither do they operate dialectically, their interventions are catastrophic. The less there is to do, the more wage increases must be demanded, since the minimal job is a more obvious sign of an absurdity than that of enforced presence. This is the class that capital transforms in its own image, even robbed of its exploitation, the use of its labor power. It couldn't pay capital too much for this denial of production, this loss of identity, this debauchery. The exploited can demand only the minimum, but lower their status and they are free to demand everything. 14. The striking thing about this is that capital can follow into these fields with relative ease. It is not too much for the unions to make those wage earners without consciousness aware of the wage-labor equivalence which capital itself has abolished. It is not too much for the unions to channel this unlimited wage blackmail into the wholesome straits of negotiation. Without the unions, the workers would immediately demand 50% or 100% or 200% increases and perhaps get them. There are examples of this in the United States and Japan. 15. Strikes. Within a system of production, strikes were historically justified as organized violence for purposes of snatching a fraction of surplus value, or else power, from the opposing violence of capital. Today this form of the strike is dead. Page 20. Page 24. 1. It is dead because capital is in a position to leave every strike to continue until it rots, precisely because we are no longer in a system of production, maximalization of surplus value. Profits be damned so long as the reproduction of the form of social relations is saved. 2. It is dead because such strikes change nothing fundamental, contemporary capital merely redistributes itself, a matter of life or death for it. At best, strikes merely snatch only what, in the end, capital would have conceded anyway. So if relations of production, and with them the class struggle, fall into orchestrated social and political relations, then clearly all that can intervene in this cycle is what escapes the organization and definition of class as a representative historical agency, a productive historical agency. Only those who escape the swings and roundabouts of production and representation can disrupt these mechanisms and provoke, from the depths of their blinded state, a return to the class struggle, which might indeed mark the end of this struggle as a locus within the political. It is here that the intervention of immigrants in recent strikes 18 takes on meaning. Because millions of workers find themselves, by means of the mechanics of discrimination, deprived of all representative authority, their appearance on the Western stage of the class struggle carries the crisis of representation to a crucial level. Kept classless by society as a whole, including the unions, and, on this point, with the economic racial complicity of their rank and file, for the organized proletarian class, centered on its relations with political economic forces with the bourgeois capitalist class, the immigrant is objectively an enemy of the class, the immigrants play, through the action of this social exclusion, the role of analysts of the relation between workers and the unions, and, more generally, of the relation between the class and every representative authority of the class. They are deviant as regards the system of political representation and of every authority who claims to speak in their name. This situation will not last. Unions and bosses have sensed the danger and have begun to reintegrate the immigrants as temporary full citizens, full-time extras on the stage of the class struggle. The autopsy of the unions. The Renault strike of March-April 1973 constituted a general repetition of this crisis. Apparently confused, uncoordinated, manipulated and, in the final analysis, a failure, except for the extraordinary terminological victory that consisted in the replacement of the once taboo term semi-skilled worker with the term agent of production. This strike was in reality the beautiful swan song of the unions, caught between their rank and file and the bosses. From the outset it was a savage strike, unleashed by semi-skilled immigrant workers. The CGT-19, however, had a weapon ready to counter this accidental war. Page 24. Page 25. Namely spreading the strike to other factories or to other sectors of the workforce, thus taking advantage of the now ritual spring mass demonstrations. Yet even this mechanism of control, which had been repeatedly tested ever since 1968, which the unions counted they could rely on for generations to come, let them down this time. Even the non-savage rank and file, at Seguin, Flins, and Sandouville, were sometimes on strike and sometimes back at work, which is also important, without paying heed to the advice from their unions. The unions were constantly being caught off guard. The workers wanted nothing to do with whatever the unions won from management and put before them. Those concessions they drew from the workers in order to relaunch negotiations with management were rejected by the management, who then closed down the factories. Management appealed to the workers while ignoring the unions, and in fact deliberately forced the crisis in order to force the unions to retreat. Couldn't they control all the workers? The unions' social legitimacy, and even their existence, was at issue. Hence the bosses, and all levels of government, adoption of a hard line. It was no longer a question of a test of strength between the organized, unionized, proletariat and the bosses, but of a test of representativity for the unions, under pressure from both the rank and file and management. Such tests result from every savage strike over the last few years sparked off by non-union personnel, rebellious youth, immigrants, the classless. The stakes at this level are extraordinary. The entire edifice of society threatens to collapse with the union's legitimacy and representativity. Adjudicators and other mediating bodies no longer count for much. Even the police are useless without the unions if the latter cannot police the factories and elsewhere. In May 68, it was the unions who saved the regime, but now their knell is being sounded. The import of the stakes is profoundly expressed in the utter confusion of events such as the Renault strike in May 68, and this holds good for student demonstrations just as it does for the Renault strikes. To strike or not to strike? Where do we stand on this? No one can decide anymore. What are the objectives? Where are the enemy? What are we talking about? The Geiger counters that the unions, parties, and microgroups used to measure the masses' readiness for combat are thrown into turmoil. The student movement is too fluid for the hands of those who would like to structure it according to their own objectives. Don't they have any objectives? In any case, it did not want to become objectified behind its back. The workers went back to work without gaining a thing, while 8 days beforehand they had refused when they were offered palpable benefits. In fact, this confusion is similar to what happens in dreams. It betrays a resistance or a censorship acting on the dream content itself. Here it betrays Something of vital importance, something difficult, however, for the proletarians themselves to accept, the social struggle has been displaced from the traditional, external enemy of the class, management, and capital, onto the internal class enemy, the proper representative authority for the class, the party, or the union. These, page 25, page 26, are the authorities to which the workers delegate their power, which is turned against them under the form of management or government delegations of power. Capital itself only alienates labor power and its product, its only monopoly is production. Parties and unions alienate social power from the exploited and have a monopoly on representation. Calling them into question is a revolutionary historical development. But this development is paid for by a loss of clarity, a loss of resolution, an apparent regression, the absence of continuity, logic, and objectives, etc. This is because everything becomes uncertain when it is a matter of confronting one's own repressive agency, of driving the unionist, shop steward, official, or spokesperson from one's own head. But the confusing character of Spring 73 indicates precisely that we have fundamentally located the problem. The unions and parties are dead, all that remains for them to do is die. The corrupted proletariat. The crisis of representation is the crucial political aspect of the latest social movements. In itself, this crisis may prove fatal to the system, and already we can see the emerging outline, in the unions themselves, of its formal overcoming, its recuperation, in a generalized schema of self-management. No more delegation of power, everyone will be fully responsible for production. The new ideological generation is coming. But it will have a great deal to do, because this crisis is intricately bound up with another crisis, deeper still, which touches production itself, the very system of productivity. And there again, indirectly of course, the immigrants are in the position of analysts. Just as they analyze the proletariat's relation to its representative agencies, they analyze the workers' relation to their own labor power, their relation to themselves as a productive force, and not only to a few of them, selected as representative authorities. This is because they have recently been extracted from a non-productivist tradition, because they had to be socially destructured in order to be thrown into the process of Western labor, and because, in return, it is they who thoroughly destructure the general process and morality of production which dominates Western societies. It is just as if their forced recruitment into the European market provoked an increasing corruption of the European proletariat as regards labor and production. It is no longer simply a matter of clandestine practices of resistance to labor, go-slows, wastage, absenteeism, etc., which have never stopped. This time the workers down tools openly, collectively and spontaneously, just like that, suddenly, asking for nothing, negotiating nothing, to the great despair of both unions and management, and started work again just as spontaneously, as a group, the following Monday. Neither failure nor victory, it was not a strike, it was just a stoppage, a euphemism which says far more than the term strike. The whole discipline of labor collapses, all the moral norms and practices that industrial colonization has imposed on Europe for 2 centuries disintegrate and are forgotten with apparent ease, without the class struggle. Page 26. Page 27. Strictly speaking, discontinuity, latitudinarianism, indiscipline as regards working hours, indifference with regard to wage pressure, to surplus, promotion, accumulation, forecasting. You do only what you have to, then stop and go back to it later. This is exactly the behavior that inhabitants of developing countries were reproached for by the colonists, who found it impossible to train the inhabitants to obey value in labor, rational and continuous time, the concept of saving wages, and so on. It is only by sending them abroad that the inhabitants were finally integrated into the labor process. And it is at precisely this point that Western workers start to regress more and more into the behavior of underdeveloped inhabitants. It is not that seeing the Western proletariat in the grip of corruption constitutes a revenge for colonization in its most advanced form, importing manual labor, although one day it might have to be the turn of the proletariat to be exported to the developing countries in order to relearn the historical and revolutionary values of labor. There is a direct relation between the ultra-colonization of immigrant workers, since the colonies were not profitable where they were, they had to be imported, and the industrial decolonization which affects every sector of society. Everywhere, in schools and in factories, we move from the hot phase of the investment of labor to the cynical and cool execution of tasks. Because they have most recently left their savage indifference for rational labor, these immigrants and the young or rural semi-skilled workers are in a position to analyze Western society with the recent, fragile, superficial and arbitrary collectivization enforced by labor, this collective paranoia, which has spawned a morality, a culture and a myth. We have forgotten that it was only 2 centuries ago that this industrial discipline was imposed, at unprecedented cost, on the West itself, that it has never quite succeeded and is beginning to crack dangerously. It will barely have lasted as long, indeed, as overseas colonization. Strike for strike's sake. Strike for strike's sake is the true condition of the contemporary struggle. Unmotivated, with neither objective nor political referent, it is the oppositional response adopted against a production which is also unmotivated, with neither a referent, nor a social use value, nor any other finality than its own production for production's sake, in short, a system which has become only a system of reproduction, revolving around itself in a gigantic tautology of the labor process. Strike for strike's sake is the complementary tautology, but, since it unveils a new form of capital corresponding to the final stage of the law of value, it is also subversive. Strikes have at last ceased to be a means, and only a means, of putting pressure on the relation of political forces in the power game. It becomes an end. Even on their own ground they negate, by means of a radical parity, the sort of finality without end that production has become. In production for production's sake, there is no more waste. We have no use for this term, which means something only in a restricted utilitarian. Page 27. Page 28. Economy. It relies on a pious critique of the system. Concord, the space program, etc., are not a waste of resources. On the contrary, since the system, having reached this high point of objective futility, produces and reproduces labor itself. Besides, this is precisely what everyone, including the workers and the unions, demands of it. Everything revolves around jobs. The social is just a matter of job creation, and in order to keep their jobs, the British unions are prepared to transform Concorde into a supersonic bomber. Inflation or unemployment. Long live inflation! Labor, like social security, has come to be just another consumer good to be distributed throughout society. The enormous paradox is that the less labor becomes a productive force, the more it becomes a product. This is not the least important characteristic of the current mutations of the capitalist system, the revolution from the specific stage of production to the stage of reproduction. It has less and less need of labor power in order to function and grow, while there are increasing demands on it to produce more and more labor. Corresponding to the absurd circularity of a system where one labors only to produce more labor is the demand for strikes for strike's sake. At any rate, this is the point at which the majority of protest strikes have today come to an end. Pay us for the days we are on strike basically means pay us in order that we may reproduce strikes for strike's sake. This is the reversal of the absurdity of the system in general. Today, all products, labor included, are beyond both use and futility. There is no more productive labor, only reproductive labor. In the same way there is no more productive or unproductive consumption, only a reproductive consumption. Leisure is as productive as labor, factory labor as unproductive as leisure or the service industries. It is irrelevant what formula we use. This indifference precisely marks the phase of the completion of political economy. Everyone is reproductive, that is, everyone has lost the concrete finality which once marked them out from one another. Nobody produces any more. Production is dead, long live reproduction. The genealogy of production. The system currently reproduces capital according to its most rigorous definition, as the form of social relations, rather than in its vulgar sense as money, profits, and the economic system. Reproduction has always been understood as, and determined by, an increasing reproduction of the mode of production, even though it became necessary to conceive of the mode of production as a modality, and not the only one, of the mode of reproduction. Productive forces and the relations of production, the sphere of material productivity in other words, are perhaps only one of many possible, and therefore historically relative, conjunctions of the process of reproduction. Reproduction is a form which far outstrips economic exploitation, and so the play of productive forces is not its necessary condition. The historical status of the proletariat, the industrial wage earners. Page 28. Page 29. Is primarily one of incarceration, concentration, and exclusion. The 17th century incarceration described by Foucault 20 expands grotesquely in the age of industrial manufacture. Didn't industrial labor, which, unlike cottage industries, is collective, controlled, and stripped of the means of production, evolve within the first great hopitas generis? In the beginning, society, in the process of rationalization, incarcerated its idle, its wanderers, its deviants. Gave them an occupation and fixed them, imposed its rational principle of labor on them. But these outcasts contaminated the process of rationalization in turn, and the rupture produced when society instituted its principle of rationality spilled over the whole of the society of labor. The Great Confinement is a model in miniature, later generalized in the industrial system of every society that, under the sign of labor and productivist finality, became a concentration camp, a detention center or a prison. Instead of extending the concepts of the proletariat and exploitation to racial or sexual oppression and such like, we should ask ourselves if it is not the other way round. What if the fundamental status of the worker, like the mad, the dead, nature, beasts, children, blacks, and women, was initially to be not exploited but excommunicated? What if he was initially not deprived and exploited but discriminated against and branded? My hypothesis is that there has never been a genuine class struggle except on the grounds of this discrimination. Subhumans struggle against their status as beasts, against the abjection of the caste division that condemns them to the subhumanity of labor. This lies behind every strike and every revolt, and today it is still behind the most wage-related demonstrations. Hence their virulence. Having said that, today the proletarian is a normal being, the worker has been promised the dignity of a full human being, and, moreover, in accordance with this category, he seizes onto every dominant discrimination. He is racist, sexist, and repressive. As regards today's deviants and whoever is discriminated against, no matter what their social standing, he has sided with the bourgeoisie and the normal human being. How true! The fundamental law of this society is not the law of exploitation, but the code of normality. May 68. The illusion of production. The first shockwaves of this transition from production to pure and simple reproduction took place in May 68. They struck the universities first, and the Faculty of Human Sciences first of all, because that was where it became most evident. Even without a clear political consciousness, that we were no longer productive, only reproductive, and that lecturers, science and culture were themselves only relays in the general reproduction of the system. All this was experienced as total futility, irresponsibility, what are sociologists for, as a relegation, and provoked the student movement of '68. Rather than the absence of prospects, since there are always plenty of prospects in reproduction, it was rather the places, the spaces where something actually happens that had ceased to exist. Page 29. Page 30. These shockwaves are still being felt. They cannot but reach the very limits of the system, as soon as entire sectors of society topple from the rank of productive forces to the pure and simple status of reproductive forces. Although this process was first felt in the cultural sectors of science, justice, and the family, the so-called superstructural sectors, it is clear today that it is progressively affecting the entire so-called infrastructural sector. A new generation of partial, savage, and occasional strikes since '68 testify no longer to the class struggle of a proletariat attached to production, but to the revolt of those who, even in the factories, are attached to reproduction. Nevertheless, in this same sector there are marginal, anomic groups who are the first to register these effects: young, semi-skilled workers brought directly from rural areas into the factories, immigrants, non-union members, and so on. For all the above-mentioned reasons, the traditional, organized, and unionist proletariat have looked likely to be the last to react, since it is they who can entertain the illusion of productive labor for longest. The consciousness of being, in relation to everyone else, the true producers and, albeit at the cost of the exploitation, nevertheless being at the very source of social wealth, is a proletarian consciousness which is reinforced and sanctioned by the organization, constituting what is certainly the most solid ideological defense against the destructuration of the current system, which, far from turning whole strata of the population into proletarians, or, as Marxian theory proper has it, expanding the exploitation of productive labor, aligns everybody under the same reproductive worker status. Productive manual workers, more than anybody else, thrive on the illusion of production just as they experience their leisure under the illusion of freedom. As long as these things are experienced as sources of wealth or satisfaction, as use value, then the worst, most alienated and exploited labor is bearable. As long as we can still discover a production corresponding, even if this is only in the imagination, to individual or social needs, this is why the concept of need is so fundamental and so mystifying. The worst individual or historical situations are bearable because the illusion of production is always the illusory coincidence of production and use value. Those who today believe in the use value of their labor power, the proletariat, are virtually the most mystified and the least susceptible to this revolt which grabs people from the depths of their total futility and the circular manipulation which turns them into pure markers of senseless reproduction. The day that this process spreads to all of society, May '68 will assume the form of a general explosion, and the problem of the link between the students and the workers will no longer be posed. It merely betrays the gulf that separates those in the current system who still believe in their own labor force and those who no longer believe in it. Page 30. Page 31. Political economy as a model of simulation. From now on, political economy is the real for us, which is to say precisely that it is the signs referential, the horizon of a defunct order whose simulation preserves it in a dialectical equilibrium. It is the real, and therefore the imaginary, since here again the two formerly distinct categories have fused and drifted together. The code, the structural law of value, uses the systematic reactivation of political economy, the restricted market law of value, as our society's imaginary real. Furthermore, the appearance of the restricted form of value is an attempt to obscure its radical form. Profit, surplus value, the mechanics of capital and the class struggle, the entire critical discourse on political economy is staged as a referential discourse. The mystery of value is enacted on stage. Of course, the mystery has simply acquired a new value. The structural law of value has become mysterious. Everyone agrees as to the determining instance of economics, and this has become obscene. 21. This is a provocation. Capital no longer looks to nature, God, or morality, but strictly to political economy and its critique for its alibis, and lives through its own denunciation from within. Itself feedback or a dialectical stimulus. Hence the essential role played by Marxian analysis in designer capital. The same scenario is played out in economics as Bourdieu and Passeron describe it, taking place in the academic system, whose alleged autonomy enables it to reproduce the class structure of society very efficiently. Similarly, the alleged autonomy of political economy, or rather its value as a determining agency, enables it to reproduce, just as efficiently, capital's symbolic function, its real domination over life and death established by the code, and which is continually stirring up political economy as a medium, an alibi, and a fig leaf. A machine has to function if it is to reproduce relations of production. A commodity must have a use value in order to sustain the system of exchange value. This was the first level scenario. Simulation is today at the second level. A commodity must function as an exchange value in order better to hide the fact that it circulates like a sign and reproduces. The code. Point 22. Society has to reproduce itself as class society, as class struggle. It must function at the Marxian critical level in order the better to mask the system's real law and the possibility of its symbolic destruction. Marcuse pointed out a long time ago that dialectical materialism was getting out of hand, far from being deconstructed by the forces of production. The relations of production from now on submit to the forces of production, science, technology, etc., and find a new legitimacy in them. There again, we must pass on to the second level, the social relations of symbolic domination utterly submit to the mode of production, both the forces of production and the relations of production, where we find, in the apparent. Page 31. Page 32. Movement of political economy and the revolution, a new legitimacy and the most perfect alibi. Hence the necessity of resurrecting and dramatizing political economy in the form of a movie script, to screen out the threat of symbolic destruction. Hence the kind of crisis, the perpetual simulacrum of a crisis, we are dealing with today. In the aesthetic stage of political economy, the finality without end of production, the ethical, ascetic myth of accumulation and labor collapses. Capital, to avoid the risk of bursting from these liquefied values, thus becomes nostalgic once more for its great ethical epoch when production had a meaning, the golden age of shortages and the development of the forces of production. In order to re-establish finalities and to reactivate the principle of economics, we must generate shortages once again. Hence ecology, where the danger of absolute scarcity reinstates an ethic of energy conservation. Hence the crisis of energy and raw materials, a real blessing for a system which, in the mirror of production, only reflects a fluctuating, empty form. The crisis will enable the return of a lost referentiality to the economic code, and will give the principle of production a gravity that evaded it. We will rediscover a taste for ascesis, that pathetic investment born of lack and deprivation. The whole recent ecological turn had already taken up this process of regeneration during the crisis, no longer a crisis of overproduction as in 1929 of the involution of the system, recycling its lost identity. 23. A crisis no longer of production, but of reproduction, hence the impossibility of grasping how much truth and how much simulacrum there may be in this crisis. Ecology is production haunted by shortages and using itself as a resource, once more discovering a natural necessity where the law of value is tried out again. But ecology is too slow. A sudden crisis, as happened with oil, constitutes a more energetic therapy. The less oil there is, the more we will become aware of how much production there is. From the moment that the place of raw materials is noted again, labor power will also resume its rightful place, and the entire mechanism of production will become intelligible once more. Production has been given another chance. So don't panic. On the eve of the intensive mobilization of labor power, when the ethics of labor power threatened to collapse, the crisis of material energy came at the right time to mask the truly catastrophic destruction of the finality of production, and displaced it onto a simple internal contradiction, but we know that the system thrives on its contradictions. There is still an illusion in thinking that the capitalist system, at a certain threshold of increased reproduction, passes irreversibly from a strategy of shortage to a strategy of abundance. The current crisis proves that this strategy is reversible. The illusion still comes from a naive faith in a reality of shortage or a reality of abundance, and therefore from the illusion of a real opposition between these two terms. When these two terms are quite. Page 32. Page 33. Simply alternatives. The strategic definition of neo-capitalism is to pass into not a phase of abundance, consumption, repressive desublimation, sexual liberation, etc., but a phase of systematic alternation between the two terms shortage and abundance, because neither retains a reference, nor therefore an antagonistic reality, and therefore because the system is indifferent to which one it employs. The indeterminacy affecting terms, the neutralization of a dialectical opposition into a pure and simple structural alternation, produces the characteristic effect of an uncertainty surrounding the reality of the crisis. Everyone tries to stave off the unbearable simulacrum effect characteristic of everything that issues from the systematic operation of the code as a conspiracy. It is comforting to think that it was great capital that provoked the crisis, because it restores a real political economic agency in the presence of a hidden subject of the crisis, and therefore an historical truth. The terror of the simulacrum is over. So much the better. It is better to have the omnipresent political economic fatality of capital than not, so long as it is clearly true. Better the economic atrocities of capital profit, exploitation than to face up to the situation we are in, where everything operates or breaks down through effects of the code. Misconstrual. Mechanisance of the truth of this global domination, if there is a global domination, is proportional to the crisis itself, where it is revealed for the first time on a massive scale. The 1929 crisis was still a crisis of capital, measured by its rates of reinvestment, surplus value, and profit, a crisis of production measured by the social finalities of consumption. The crisis is resolved by regulating demand in an endless exchange of finalities between production and consumption. From now on, and conclusively after the Second World War, production and consumption cease to be opposed and possibly contradictory poles. At a stroke, the entire economic field loses all internal determinacy along with the very possibility of a crisis. It no longer survives except as a process of economic simulation at the fringes of a process of reproduction, into which it is entirely absorbed. 24. Have there ever been real shortages to grant the economic principle a reality, so that today we could say that it is disappearing and no longer functions save as a myth, an alternative myth, moreover, to that of abundance? In the course of history, have shortages ever had a use value, an irreducible economic finality, so that today we could say that it has disappeared in the cycle of reproduction, merely consolidating the code's hegemonic control over genuine matters of life and death? We are saying that in order for the economy to produce itself, and this is all it ever produces, it needs this dialectical tension between scarcity and abundance. For the system to reproduce itself, however, it now requires only the mythical operation of the economy. It is because the entire economic sphere has been diffused that everything can be expressed in terms of political economy and production. Economics, preferably in its Marxian variety, becomes the explicit dispatch. Page 33. Page 34. Course of a whole society, the vulgate of every analysis. Sociologists, human scientists, etc. Even Christians, especially Christians of course, turn to Marxism as the discourse to which they refer. A whole new divine left is rising. Everything has become political and ideological by the same endless drift of the operation of integration. The news flash is political, sport is political, not to mention art, reason is everywhere on the side of the class struggle. The entire latent discourse of capital has become manifest. We notice a widespread jubilation secure in the assumption of this truth. May 68 marked the decisive step in the naturalization of political economy. Because the shock of May 68 shook the system down to the depths of its symbolic organization, it has given urgency to a vital transition from superstructural, moral, cultural, etc., ideologies to an ideologization of the infrastructure itself. By giving official status to oppositional discourse, capital will consolidate its power under cover of economic and political legislation. Political economy. Marxian political economy has sealed the rift of May 68, just as the unions and the left-wing parties negotiated the crisis on the ground. The hidden referent of economics and politics has therefore been dug up only in order to retrieve a catastrophic situation, and today it continues to be circulated, generalized, and desperately reproduced, since the catastrophic situation opened up by May 68 is not over. If we dared, we would say that economics and its critique are only superstructural. We will not dare, however, since to do so would only be to twist this old image around. Where would the infrastructure be then? Etc. It would also provide economics with a chance to reappear one day in accordance with the seesaw effect which itself belongs to the code. We have been tricked too often with the infrastructure to start this mask play up again. The system itself has put an end to infra and superstructural determinations. Today it pretends to take political economy as the infrastructure because Marx kindly whispered this alternative strategy to it, but actually capital has never really functioned on this imaginary distinction. It is not that naive. Its potency comes directly from its simultaneous development at every level, and from never having fundamentally posed itself the question of determination, the cunning distinction of agencies, or ideology. It has never confused itself with production, as did Marx and every subsequent revolutionary who believed and still believes in production, confusing their fantasies with their lunatic hopes. For its part, capital is content to extend its laws in a single movement, inexorably occupying all the interstices of life without confusing its priorities. If it has set men to work, capital has also impelled them to culture, needs, languages and functional idioms, information and communication. It directs them to rights, to liberty and sexuality. It forces the instinct of preservation and the death instinct upon them. It has set them up everywhere in accordance with myths that are simultaneously opposed and indifferent. This is its only law, indifference. To set up a hierarchy of page 34, page 35. Agencies would be far too dangerous a game, and would run the risk of backfiring. No, better to level out, neutralize, cover over and indifferentiate, which is what it knows how to do. That's how it follows its law. But it also dissimulates this fundamental process under the determinant mask of political economy. In the immense polymorphous machine of contemporary capital, the symbolic, gift and counter-gift, reciprocity and reversal, expenditure and sacrifice, no longer counts for anything. Nature, the great referential of the origin and substance The subject/object dialectic, and so on, no longer counts. Political economy itself only survives in a brain-dead state, but all these phantoms continue to plague the operational field of value. Perhaps here, on an immense scale, we can discern the echo of what Marx drew to our attention. Every event first passes through an historical existence before being revived under a parodical form. In our day, however, these two phases telescope, since good old materialist history has itself become a process of simulation, no longer even offering the chance of a grotesque, theatrical parody. Today the terror based on things voided of their substance exerts itself directly, and simulacra immediately anticipate every determination of our lives. Now, rather than theatre and the imaginary, there is a fierce strategy of neutralization that no longer leaves any significant place for a Napoleon III type slapstick, an historical farce which, to Marx's mind, is effortlessly overcome by real history. It is a different matter as regards the simulacra which eliminate both ourselves and history simultaneously. But perhaps all this arises from a general illusion in Marx concerning the possibilities for a revolution of the system. He had clearly seen the extent to which there already lurked in capital in his own time a capacity for it to undermine its own bases and go into overdrive. He clearly saw that capital tended to reduce, if not totally eliminate, the labor power in its processes, and substitute a dead labor power for it. Since, however, he thought that living labor power was the objective, historical and necessary foundation of capital, he could only think that it was digging its own grave. The illusion is that capital buried labor power. More subtly, however, it turns labor power into the second term of a stable opposition with capital. It makes this rupturing energy which should shatter the relations of production into a term homogeneous with the relations of production, in a simulation of opposition under the sign of dead labor. From now on a single hegemonic agency, dead labor, divides into capital and living labor. The antagonism is resolved by a binary apparatus of coded operativity. But what, you might ask, of surplus value in production? All right, capital doesn't give a damn. Without lending capital a Marxist's intuition, even though Marx did everything he could to alert capital to what was waiting for it, if it persisted in playing on the terrain of production, it was heading for its death in the short term. The economy was a fatal trap for capital. Everything happened as if it had clearly understood Marx on this point, and had, in consequence, chosen to liquidate production so as to go on to another kind of strategy. I am saying, page 35, page 36, that everything happens as if, because it is not completely certain that capital ever had this productivist view of itself. Marx was basically the only one who had, and he projected this fantasy onto it as an historical truth. It is more likely that it only ever played at production, even if this meant that production had to be abandoned at a later stage, were it to draw capital into fatal contradictions. Has capital ever taken production seriously? Don't be so stupid. At the height of the seriousness of production, capital is doubtless only a simulation. That is why the only acts that accompany capital's real domination are situated in the field of this radical indeterminacy. And break with this dissuasive economic strategy. We will not destroy the system by a direct, dialectical revolution of the economic or political infrastructure. Everything produced by contradiction, by the relation of forces, or by energy in general, will only feed back into the mechanism and give it impetus, following a circular distortion similar to a Mobius strip. We will never defeat it by following its own logic of energy, calculation, reason, and revolution, history and power, or some finality or counter-finality. The worst violence at this level has no purchase, and will only backfire against itself. We will never defeat the system on the plane of the real, the worst error of all our revolutionary strategies is to believe that we will put an end to the system on the plane of the real. This is their imaginary, imposed on them by the system itself, living or surviving only by always leading those who attack the system to fight amongst each other on the terrain of reality, which is always the reality of the system. This is where they throw all their energies, their imaginary violence, where an implacable logic constantly turns back into the system. We have only to do it violence or counter-violence, since it thrives on symbolic violence, not in the degraded sense in which this formula has found fortune, as a violence of signs, from which the system draws strength, or with which it masks its material violence. Symbolic violence is deduced from a logic of the symbolic, which has nothing to do with the sign or with energy reversal, the incessant reversibility of the counter-gift, and, conversely, the seizing of power by the unilateral exercise of the gift. 25. We must therefore displace everything into the sphere of the symbolic, where challenge, reversal and overbidding are the law, so that we can respond to death only by an equal or superior death. There is no question here of real violence or force, the only question concerns the challenge and the logic of the symbolic. If domination comes from the system's retention of the exclusivity of the gift without counter-gift, the gift of work which can only be responded to by destruction or sacrifice, if not in consumption, which is only a spiral of the system of surplus gratification without result. Therefore a spiral of surplus domination, a gift of media and messages to which, due to the monopoly of the code, nothing is allowed to retort, the gift, everywhere and at every instant, of the social, of the protection agency, security, gratification and the solicitation of the social, from which nothing is any longer permitted to escape, then the only solution is to turn. Page 36. Page 37. The principle of its power back against the system itself, the impossibility of responding or retorting. To defy the system with a gift to which it cannot respond save by its own collapse and death. Nothing, not even the system, can avoid the symbolic obligation, and it is in this trap that the only chance of a catastrophe for capital remains. The system turns on itself, as a scorpion does when encircled by the challenge of death. For it is summoned to answer, if it is not to lose face to what can only be death. The system must itself commit suicide in response to the multiplied challenge of death and suicide. So hostages are taken on the symbolic or sacrificial plane, from which every moral consideration of the innocence of the victims is ruled out. The hostage is the substitute, the alter ego of the terrorist, the hostage's death for the terrorists. Hostage and terrorist may thereafter become confused in the same sacrificial act. The stakes are death without any possibility of negotiation, and therefore return to an inevitable overbidding. Of course, they attempt to deploy the whole system of negotiation, and the terrorists themselves often enter into this exchange scenario in terms of this calculated equivalence, the hostages' lives against some ransom or liberation, or indeed for the prestige of the operation alone. From this perspective, taking hostages is not original at all, it simply creates an unforeseen and selective relation of forces which can be resolved either by traditional violence or by negotiation. It is a tactical action. There is something else at stake, however, as we dearly saw at The Hague over the course of 10 days of incredible negotiations. No one knew what could be negotiated, nor could they agree on terms, nor on the possible equivalences of the exchange. Or, again, even if they were formulated, the terrorists' demands amounted to a radical denial of negotiation. It is precisely here that everything is played out, for with the impossibility of all negotiation we pass into the symbolic order, which is ignorant of this type of calculation and exchange. The system itself lives solely by negotiation, even if this takes place in the equilibrium of violence. The system can only respond to this eruption of the symbolic, the most serious thing to befall it, basically the only revolution, by the real, physical death of the terrorists. This, however, is its defeat, since their death was their stake, so that by bringing about their deaths the system has merely impaled itself on its own violence, without really responding to the challenge that was thrown to it. Because the system can easily compute every death, even war atrocities, but cannot compute the death challenge or symbolic death, since this death has no calculable equivalent, it opens up an inexpiable overbidding by other means than a death in exchange. Nothing corresponds to death, except death, which is precisely what happens in this case. The system itself is driven to suicide in return, which suicide is manifest in its disarray and defeat. However infinitesimal in terms of relations of forces it might be, the colossal apparatus of power is eliminated in this situation where, the very excess of its derision is turned back against itself. The police and the army, all the institutions and mobilized violence of power whether individually or page 37. Page 38. Massed together, can do nothing against this lowly but symbolic death. For this death draws it onto a plane where there is no longer any response possible for it, hence the sudden structural liquefaction of power in 68, not because it was less strong, but because of the simple symbolic displacement operated by the student's practices. The system can only die in exchange, defeat itself to lift the challenge. Its death at this instant is a symbolic response, but a death which wears it out. The challenge has the efficiency of a murderer. Every society apart from ours knows that, or used to know it. Ours is in the process of rediscovering it. The roots of symbolic effectiveness are those of an alternative politics. Thus the dying ascetic challenges God ever to give him the equivalent of this death. God does all he can to give him this equivalent 100 times over, in the form of prestige, of spiritual power, indeed of global hegemony. But the ascetic's secret dream is to attain such an extent of mortification that even God would be unable either to take up the challenge, or to absorb the debt. He will then have triumphed over God, and become God himself. That is why the ascetic is always close to heresy and sacrilege, and as such condemned by the Church, whose function it is merely to preserve God from this symbolic face-to-face, to protect him from this mortal challenge where he is summoned to die, to sacrifice himself, in order to take up the challenge of the mortified ascetic. The Church will have had this role for all time, avoiding this type of catastrophic confrontation, catastrophic primarily for the Church, and substituting a rule-bound exchange of penitences and gratifications, the impresario of a system of equivalences between God and men. The same situation exists in our relation to the system of power. All these institutions, all these social, economic, political, and psychological mediations, are there so that no one ever has the opportunity to issue this symbolic challenge, this challenge to the death, the irreversible gift which, like the absolute mortification of the ascetic, brings about a victory over all power, however powerful its authority may be. It is no longer necessary that the possibility of this direct symbolic confrontation ever takes place. And this is the source of our profound boredom. This is why taking hostages and other similar acts rekindle some fascination. They are at once an exorbitant mirror for the system of its own repressive violence, and the model of a symbolic violence which is always forbidden it, the only violence it cannot exert, its own death. Labor and death. Other societies have known multiple stakes, over birth and kinship, the soul and the body, the true and the false, reality and appearance. Political economy has reduced them to just one, production. But then the stakes were large, the violence extreme and hopes too high. Today this is over. The system has rid production of all real stakes. A more radical truth is page 38. Page 39. Dawning, however, and the system's victory allows us to glimpse this fundamental stake. It is even retrospectively becoming possible to analyze the whole of political economy as having nothing to do with production, as having stakes of life and death. A symbolic stake. Every stake is symbolic. There have only ever been symbolic stakes. This dimension is etched everywhere into the structural law of value, everywhere immanent in the code. Labor power is instituted on death. A man must die to become labor power. He converts this death into a wage. But the economic violence capital inflicted on him in the equivalence of the wage and labor power is nothing next to the symbolic violence inflicted on him by his definition as a productive force. Faking this equivalence is nothing next to the equivalence, qua signs, of wages and death. The very possibility of quantitative equivalence presupposes death. The equivalence of wages and labor power presupposes the death of the worker, while that of any commodity and any other presupposes the symbolic extermination of objects. Death makes the calculation of equivalence, and regulation by indifference, possible in general. This death is not violent and physical, it is the indifferent consumption of life and death, the mutual neutralization of life and death in survival, or death deferred. Labor is slow death. This is generally understood in the sense of physical exhaustion. But it must be understood in another sense. Labor is not opposed, like a sort of death, to the fulfillment of life, which is the idealist view. Labor is opposed as a slow death to a violent death. That is the symbolic reality. Labor is opposed as deferred death to the immediate death of sacrifice. Against every pious and revolutionary view of the labor, or culture, is the opposite of life type. We must maintain that the only alternative to labor is not free time, or non-labor, it is sacrifice. All this becomes clear in the genealogy of the slave. First, the prisoner of war is purely and simply put to death, one does him an honor in this way. Then he is spared épargne and conserve, equals service, under the category of spoils of war and a prestige good, he becomes a slave and passes into sumptuary domesticity. It is only later that he passes into servile labor. However, he is no longer a laborer, since labor only appears in the phase of the serf or the emancipated slave, finally relieved of the mortgage of being put to death. Why is he freed? Precisely in order to work. Labor therefore everywhere draws its inspiration from deferred death. It comes from deferred death. Slow or violent, immediate or deferred, the scansion of death is decisive. It is what radically distinguishes two types of organization, the economic and the sacrificial. We live irreversibly in the first of these, which has inexorably taken root in the difference of death. The scenario has never changed. Whoever works has not been put to death, he is refused this honor. And labor is first of all the sign of being judged worthy only of life. Does capital exploit the workers to death? Paradoxically, the worst it inflicts on them is refusing them death. It is by page 39, page 40, deferring their death that they are made into slaves and condemned to the indefinite abjection of a life of labor. The substance of labor and exploitation is indifferent in this symbolic relation. The power of the master always primarily derives from this suspension of death. Power is therefore never, contrary to what we might imagine, the power of putting to death, but exactly the opposite, that of allowing to live a life that the slave lacks the power to give. The master confiscates the death of the other while retaining the right to risk his own. The slave is refused this, and is condemned to a life without return, and therefore without possible expiation. By removing death, the master removes the slave from the circulation of symbolic goods. This is the violence the master does to the slave, condemning him to labor power. There lies the secret of power, in the dialectic of the master and the slave. Hegel also derives the domination of the master from the deferred threat of death hanging over the slave. Labor, production and exploitation would only be one of the possible avatars of this power structure, which is a structure of death. This changes every revolutionary perspective on the abolition of power. If power is death deferred, it will not be removed. Insofar as the suspension of this death will not be removed. And if power, of which this is always and everywhere the definition, resides in the act of giving without being given, it is clear that the power the master has to unilaterally grant life will only be abolished if this life can be given to him in a non-deferred death. There is no other alternative. You will never abolish this power by staying alive, since there will have been no reversal of what has been given. Only the surrender of this life, retaliating against a deferred death with an immediate death, constitutes a radical response, and the only possibility of abolishing power. No revolutionary strategy can begin without the slave putting his own death back at stake, since this is what the master puts off in the difference from which he profits by securing his power. Refuse to be put to death, refuse to live in the mortal reprieve of power, refuse the duty of this life and never be quits with living, in effect be under obligation to settle this long-term credit through the slow death of labor, since this slow death does not alter the future of this abject dimension, in the fatality of power. Violent death changes everything, slow death changes nothing, for there is a rhythm, a scansion necessary to symbolic exchange, something has to be given in the same movement and following the same rhythm, otherwise there is no reciprocity and it is quite simply not given. The strategy of the system of power is to displace the time of the exchange, substituting continuity and mortal linearity for the immediate retaliation of death. It is thus futile for the slave, the worker, to give little by little, in infinitesimal doses, to the rope of labor on which he is hung to death, to give his life to the master or to capital, for this sacrifice in small doses is no longer a sacrifice. It doesn't touch the most important thing, the difference of death, and merely distills a process whose structure remains the same. We could in fact advance the hypothesis that in labor the exploited, page 40, page 41, renders his life to the exploiter and thereby regains, by means of this very exploitation, a power of symbolic response. There was counter-power in the labor process as the exploited put their own, slow, death at stake. Here we agree with Lyotard's hypothesis on the level of libidinal economics, the intensity of the exploited's enjoyment jouissance in their very abjection. And Lyotard is right. Libidinal intensity, the charge of desire and the surrendering of death are always there in the exploited, 26 but no longer on the properly symbolic rhythm of the immediate retaliation, and therefore total resolution. The enjoyment of powerlessness, on sole condition that this is not a fantasy aimed at reinstating the triumph of desire at the level of the proletariat, will never abolish power. The very modality of the response to the slow death of labor leaves the master the possibility of, once again, repeatedly, giving the slave life through labor. The accounts are never settled, it always profits power, the dialectic of power which plays on the splitting of the poles of death, the poles of exchange. The slave remains the prisoner of the master's dialectic, while his death, or his distilled life, serves the indefinite repetition of domination. This domination increases as the system is charged with neutralizing the symbolic retaliation by buying it back through wages. If, through labor, the exploited attempts to give his life to the exploiter, the latter wards off this restitution by means of wages. Here again we must take a symbolic radiograph. Contrary to all appearances and experience, capital buys its labor power from the worker and extorts surplus labor, capital gives labor to the worker, and the worker himself gives capital to the capitalist. In German this is Arbeitgeber, the entrepreneur is a provider of labor, and Arbeitnehmer, it is the capitalist who who has the initiative of the gift, which secures him, as in every social order, a preeminence and a power far beyond the economic. The refusal of labor, in its radical form, is the refusal of this symbolic domination and the humiliation of being bestowed upon. The gift and the taking of labor function directly as the code of the dominant social relation, as the code of discrimination. Wages are the mark of this poisonous gift, the sign which epitomizes the whole code. They sanction this unilateral gift of labor, or rather wages symbolically buy back the domination exercised by capital through the gift of labor. At the same time, they furnish capital with the possibility of confining the operation to a contractual dimension, thus stabilizing confrontation on economic ground. Furthermore, wages turn the wage earner into a consumer of goods, reiterating his status as a consumer of labor and reinforcing his symbolic deficit. To refuse labor, to dispute wages is thus to put the process of the gift, expiation, and economic compensation back into question, and therefore to expose the fundamental symbolic process. Wages are no longer grabbed today. You too are given a wage, not in exchange for labor, but so that you spend it, which is itself another kind of labor. In the consumption or use of objects, the wage consumer finds. Page 41. Page 42. Herself reproducing exactly the same symbolic relation of slow death as she undergoes in labor. The user experiences exactly the same deferred death in the object. She does not sacrifice it, she uses it and uses it functionally, as the worker does in capital. And just as wages buy back this unilateral gift of labor, the price paid for the object is only the user buying back the object's deferred death. The proof of this lies in the symbolic rule which states that what falls to you without charge, lotteries, presents, gambling wins, must not be devoted to use, but spent as pure loss. Every domination must be bought back, redeemed. This was formerly done through sacrificial death, the ritual death of the king or the leader, or even by ritual inversion, feasts and other social rites, but these are still forms of sacrifice. This social game of reversal comes to an end with the dialectic of the master and the slave, where the reversibility of power cedes its place to a dialectic of the reproduction of power. The redemption of power must always, however, be simulated. And this is done by the apparatus of capital where formal redemption takes place throughout the immense machine of labor, wages, and consumption. Economics is the sphere of redemption par excellence, where the domination of capital manages to redeem itself without ever really putting itself at stake. On the contrary, it diverts the process of redemption into its own infinite reproduction. This is perhaps where we find the necessity of economics and its historical appearance. At the level of societies so much more vast and mobile than primitive groups, where the urgency of a system of redemption which could be measured, controlled, and infinitely extended, which rituals cannot be, all at the same time, and which above all would not put the exercise and heredity of power back into question. Production and consumption are an original and unprecedented solution to this problem. By simulating redemption in this new form, the slide from the symbolic into the economic allows the definitive hegemony of political force over society to be secured. Economics miraculously succeeds in masking the real structure of power by reversing the terms of its definition. While power consists in unilateral giving, of life in particular, see above, a contrary interpretation has been successfully imposed. Power would consist in a unilateral taking and appropriation. Under cover of this ingenious retraction, real symbolic domination can continue to do as it will, since all the efforts of those under this domination will rush into the trap of taking back from power what it has taken from them, even taking power themselves, thus blindly pushing on along the lines of their domination. In fact, labor, wages, power, and revolution must all be read against the grain. Labor is not exploitation, it is given by capital. Wages are not grabbed, capital gives them to it does not buy a labor power, it buys back the power of capital. 27. Page 42. Page 43. The slow death of labor is not endured, it is a desperate attempt, a challenge to capital's unilateral gift of labor. The only effective reply to power is to give it back what it gives you, and this is only symbolically possible by means of death. However, if, as we have seen, the system itself deposes economics, removes its substance and its credibility, then, in this perspective, doesn't it put its own symbolic domination back into question? No, since the system brings about the overall reign of its power strategy, the gift without counter-gift, which becomes fused with deferred death. The same social relations are set up in the media and in consumption, where we have seen, Requiem pour les médias utopie, 4, 1971. That there is no possible response or counter-gift to the unilateral delivery of messages. We were able to interpret Surfy's project concerning automobile accidents, auto slaughter as the price that the collective pays to its institutions. The state's gifts inscribe a debt in the collective accounts book. Gratuitous death is then merely an attempt to absorb this deficit. The blood on the roads is a desperate form of compensation for the state's tarmac gifts. The accident thus takes its place in the space that institutes a symbolic debt towards the state. It is likely that the more this debt grows, the more marked will be the tendency towards the accident. Every rational strategy for curbing this phenomenon, prevention, speed limits, rescue services, repression, is effectively negligible. They simulate the possibility of integrating the accident into a rational system, and are therefore incapable of grasping the root of the problem, balancing a symbolic debt which founds, legitimates, and reinforces the collective dependency on the state. On the contrary, these rational strategies accentuate the phenomenon. In order to avert the effects of accidents, they propose to institute more mechanisms, more state institutions, supplementary gifts, which are simply means of aggravating the symbolic debt. In this way the struggle is everywhere opposed to a political authority, cf. Pierre Clas Trace, Society Against the State Tr. Hurley and A. Stein, New York, Zone Books, 1990, which sets all the power it can draw from its showers of gifts, the survival it maintains and the death it withdraws above the struggle in order to stockpile and then distill it for its own ends. Nobody really accepts this bonus forever, you give what you can. 28 But power always gives more so as to serve better, and an entire society or a few individuals can go to great lengths, even their own destruction, to put an end to it. This is the only absolute weapon, and the mere collective threat of it can make power collapse. Power, faced with this symbolic blackmail, the barricades of 68, hostage-taking, loses its footing. Since it thrives on my slow death, I will oppose it with my violent death. And it is because we are living with slow death that we dream of a violent death. Even this dream is unbearable to power. Notes 1. If it were only a question of the ascendancy of exchange value over use value, or the ascendancy of the structural over the functional dimension of language, then Marx end. Page 43. Page 44. Saussure have already signaled it. Marx almost turns use value into the medium or the alibi, pure and simple, of exchange value. His entire analysis is based on the principle of equivalence at the core of the system of exchange value. But if equivalence is at the core of the system, there is no indeterminacy in the global system, there is always a dialectical determinacy and finality of the mode of production. The current system, however, is itself based on indeterminacy, and draws impetus from it. Conversely, it is haunted by the death of all determinacy. 2. See Jean Baudrillard, for a critique of the political economy of the sign, Tr. Charles Levin, St. Louis, M.O., Telos. 1972 tr. 3. Theoretical production, like material production, loses its determinacy and begins to turn around itself, slipping abis ala an abim towards a reality that cannot be found. This is where we are today, undecidability, the era of floating theories, as much as floating money. No matter what perspective they come from, the psychoanalytic included, no matter with what violence they struggle and claim to rediscover an immanence, or a movement without systems of reference, Deleuze, Lyotard, etc., all contemporary theories are floating and have no meaning other than to serve as signs for one another. It is pointless to insist on their coherence with some reality, whatever that might be. The system has removed every secure reference from theory as it has from any other labor power. Theory no longer has any use of value. The theoretical mirror of production has also cracked. So much the better. What I mean is that the very undecidability of theory is an effect of the code. Let there be no illusions, there is no schizophrenic drift about this flotation of theories, where flows pass freely over the body without organs, of what? Capital. It merely signifies that any theory can from now on be exchanged against any other according to variable exchange rates, but without any longer being invested anywhere, unless it is the mirror of their writing. 4 cf. Jean-François Lyotard, Libidinal Economy, TRIH. Grant, London, Athlone, 1992 tr. 5 in English in the original tr. 6 in English in the original tr. 7 Marx, that cunning Jesuit, was not far from recognizing this with his concept of the collective laborer. The product is transformed from the direct product of the individual producer into a social product, the joint product of a collective laborer, i.e., a combination of workers, each of whom stands at a different distance from the actual manipulation of the object of labor. With the progressive accentuation of the cooperative character of the labor process, there necessarily occurs a progressive extension of the concept of productive labor, and of the concept of the bearer of that labor, the productive worker. In order to work productively, it is no longer necessary for the individual himself to put his hand to the object, it is sufficient for him to be an organ of the collective laborer, and to perform any one of its subordinate functions. The definition of productive labor given above, the original definition, is derived from the nature of material production itself. And it remains correct for the collective laborer, considered as a whole. But it no longer holds good for each member taken individually. Capital, pages 6434 J.Bs emphases. 8 Free time is, so to speak, a form of complex labor, in the sense that, as opposed to simple labor, it accords with the definition of service, solidarity of the prestation and the prestator, non-equivalence to a time of abstract social labor, non-equivalence to a wage which reproduces labor power. Marx would have been able to see this were he not myopically concerned with productive labor and the multiple distinctions which together tend to salvage the subject of history, the productive worker. The reification of labor power, driven to perfection, would shatter the reified form by cutting the chain that ties the individual to the machinery, writes Marcuse. Automation would open the dimension of free time as the one in which man's private and societal existence would constitute itself. Herbert Marcuse, 1. Dimensional Man, London, Routledge. Page 44. Page 45. And Keegan Paul, 1964, p. 37. Instead of fantasizing over free time, Marcuse understood that the system, throughout the technical progress and automation, produces free time as the extreme reification of labor power, as the accomplished form of abstract social labor time, simply by being the inverted simulation of non-labor. Job training, qualification, and education, etc., are other forms of complex labor. There is also a temptation to Analyze them in terms of surplus value, of the reinvestment by capital of science, training, and research, of a constant capital supradd to the ordinary worker. Adam Smith writes, a man educated at the expense of much labor and time may be compared to one of those expensive machines, The Wealth of Nations. Oxford University Press, 1976 Volume 1, p. 118. This is an error. Instruction, education, and training are not long-term investments. They are rather the direct social relation of domestication and control. Capital doesn't look for any complex labor in this, but indulges in absolute waste, sacrificing an enormous part of its surplus value in the reproduction of its hegemony. 9. Paid unemployment already provides an example of this, 1 year of severance pay in France at the time of writing. In certain other countries, however, it has been replaced by a negative taxation scheme, which provides for a basic minimum wage for all, housewives, the handicapped, the young unemployed, to be deducted from eventual paid labor. Unemployment quite simply disappears here as a critical conjunction, with all the political implications it used to have. Labor becomes an option, while wages become a certificate of existence, an automatic inscription in the social apparatus. Capital still remains as wages, but this time in its pure form freed from a labor, as the signifier, following Saussures' analogy, was freed from the signified, which was only an occasional content of capital. 10. Throughout the social evolution of housing, we can see how capital's strategy has displaced itself from an economic process to an extensive process. In the beginning, workers' housing was simply a dorm, a branch of the factory, a functional site for the reproduction of labor power, a strategic site for both manufacture and business. Housing was not invested with the form of capital. Gradually, housing is invested as a space-time marked by a direct and generalized process of the control of social space. It becomes a site of reproduction, not of labor, but of the habitat itself as a specific function, as a direct form of social relation, no longer the reproduction of the worker, but of the inhabitant herself, the user. After the proletariat, the user has become the ideal type of the industrial slave. The user of goods, of words, the user of sex. The user of labor herself, the worker, or the agent of production, becomes the user of the factory and of her labor. As individual and collective equipment, as a social service, the user of transport, but also the user of her life and death. This decentered, extensive strategy, this all-out attack, the use or appropriation of use value is the ultimate form of the self-management of social control. 11. Thus the Californian utopia of the cybernetic disintegration of the tertiary metropolis, home-based computer labor. Labor is pulverized into every pore of society and everyday life. As well as labor power, the space-time of labor also ceases to exist. Society constitutes nothing but a single continuum of the processes of value. Labor has become a way of life. Nothing can reinstate the factory walls, the golden age of the factory and class struggle against the ubiquity of capital, surplus value, and labor, against their inevitable disappearance as such. The worker merely nourishes the imaginary of the struggle, just as the cop nourishes the imaginary of repression. 12. The concept of surplus value has simply lost any meaning as regards a system which, from reproducing labor power in order to generate profit and surplus value, has now become reproductive of life in its entirety through advanced redistribution or reinjection of every equivalent of social surplus labor. From this point on, surplus value is everywhere and nowhere. Capital no longer has any incidental expenses, nor on the other hand has it any profit in the sense of a unilateral extortion. The law of the system requires that you give yourself up to its redistributions in order that it circulates and that. Page 45. Page 46. Each and everyone, caught in the tightly woven net of this incessant redistribution, might become a manager, while the whole group becomes able to manage its own surplus value, thus implicating oneself fundamentally within the everyday political order of capital. And just as, viewed from the point of view of capital, surplus value has lost all meaning, it has also lost all meaning from the point of view of the exploited. The distinction between a fraction of labor returning as a wage and a remainder called surplus value has lost all meaning from the point of view of the worker who used to reproduce her labor power as a wage, but now reproduces her entire life in a generalized process of labor. 13. Baudrillard is playing on the French term investissement, used to translate Freud's Besetzung, rendered in English as cathexis. The French term covers the political and libidinal economic sense of investment as well as the military sense of the occupation of hostile territory. Tr. 14. Other parallel forms of maximalist reversal, equal wages for all, the struggle against qualifications. All these forms seek the end of the division of labor, the end of labor as social relation, and the end of the law of equivalence in the field of wages and labor power, which is of fundamental importance for the system. Therefore they indirectly target the very form of political economy. 15. This same phenomenon arises in the developing countries. There is no upper limit to the cost of raw materials once they, outside the grasp of economics, become the sign and the gauge of the acceptance of a global political order, a peaceful planetary coexistence where the developing countries are forcibly socialized under the great powers. The escalation of prices then becomes a challenge, not only to the wealth of the Western countries, but also to the political system of peaceful coexistence in the face of a single predominant global political class. Whether this class is capitalist or communist is of minor importance. Before the oil crisis, the Arabs made traditional wage demands: petrol must be sold at the right price. Now, however, these demands have turned around and become unlimited and maximal. 16. The energy crisis gave both types of inflation an alibi and a perfect deterrent in one go. From this point on, inflation as a structural crisis internal to the system may be plausibly blamed on the overvaluation of energy and raw materials by the countries that produce them. Disaffection with the productivist system, which, amongst other things, is expressed in the maximal wage challenge, may be counteracted by the threat of poverty, that is, by threatening the use value of the economic system itself. 17. C. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia I, Tr. Hurley, M. Seamand. H.R. Lane, London, Athlone, 1984, for an exposition of the Deleuzian unconscious. Tr. 18. This intervention, however, is not exclusive of any other group deprived of social representation. When young women, high school students, homosexuals, and even proles become savages, or if we admit that basically the unions do not represent them at all, but only themselves, then we all in like manner become immigrants. On the other hand, these groups might cease to be immigrants. There are then no immigrants as such, and they do not constitute a new historical subject, a neo-proletariat who would take over as the other. 19. Confédération Générale du Travail, the French Trades Union Congress. Tr. 24. An exposition of the Great Confinement, see Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization, Tr. Richard Howard. London, Tavistock, 1967. Tr. 21. As an illustration of this, we might analyze an advert for the Banque Nationale de Paris, BNP, which reads, "I am interested in your money, fair lend me your money and you may profit from my bank." To begin with, this is the first time that capital, in its frontline institution, namely international finance capital, has so clearly and openly stated the law of equivalence, and, surprisingly, in the form of an advertising slogan. These things are usually unstated. Page 46. Page 47. Commercial exchange is seen as immoral, and all publicity tries to cover this up as a matter of urgency. We may therefore be sure that this candor is a second-degree mask. Secondly, its apparent aim is to convince people on economic grounds to do themselves a good turn and take their money to the BNP. Its real strategy remains unofficial, however, to convince people by this man-to-man capitalist openness, saying let's not be sentimental about this, no more of the ideology of dependence, cards on the table, etc. And so to seduce people by means of the obscenity of revealing the hidden, immoral law of equivalence. This is a macho complicity where men share the obscene truth of capital. Hence the smell of lechery about his advert, the salaciousness and smuttiness of the eyes glued to your money as if it were your genitals. The technique used by the advert is a perverse provocation which is much more subtle than the simplistic seduction of the smile, such as was the theme of the Société Générale's A Bank TR counter-offensive. It is not the banker who should smile, but the client. People are seduced by the obscenity of the economic, taken to the level of the perverse fascination that the very atrocity of capital exercises on them. From this perspective the slogan quite simply signifies, I am interested in your arse fares fair, lend me your buttocks and I'll bugger you, which is not to everyone's distaste. Behind the humanist morality of exchange there is a profound desire for capital, a vertiginous desire for the law of value, and this complicity, both economic and non-economic, is what the advert, perhaps without knowing it, seeks to recover, testifying to an intuition for politics. Thirdly, the advertising executives could not have been unaware that this advert, with its vampiric image, scared the middle classes, so that to emphasize their lecherous complicity with this direct attack would provoke negative reactions. Why did they take this risk? Here we have the strangest trap. The advert was made to consolidate the resistance to the law of profit and equivalence so as to be better able to impose the equivalence of capital, profit, and the economic in general, the fair's fair, at a time when this is no longer true, when capital has displaced its strategy, and so is able to state its law since it is no longer its truth. Announcing this law is nothing more than a supplementary mystification. Capital no longer thrives on the rule of any economic law, which is why the law can be made into an advertising slogan, falling into the sphere of the sign and its manipulation. The economic is only the quantitative theatre of value. This, as well as the fact that the role of money in all this is only a pretext, is expressed by the advert in its own way. Hence the commutability of the advert itself, which can operate at every level. For example, I am interested in your unconscious fares fair, lend me your fantasies and you may profit from my analysis. I am interested in your death fares fair, take out a life insurance policy and I will make your death into a fortune. I am interested in your productivity fares fair, lend me your labor power and you may profit from my capital. And so on. This advert could serve as a general equivalent for all real social relations. Finally, if the advert's basic message is not equivalence, A equals A, fair's fair, no one is fooled, as the advertising executives well know. Could it be surplus value, the fact that the operation ends up, for the banker and for capital, showing the equation, A equals A plus A? The advert can barely conceal this truth, and everyone can sense it. Capital slips in and out of the shadows here, almost unmasking itself, but it is not serious since what the advert really says comes neither from the order of quantitative equivalence, nor from surplus value, but from the order of the tautology. Page 47. Page 48. That is, a bank is a bank, a banker is a banker, money is money, and you can have none of it. While pretending to state the economic law of equivalence, the advert actually states the tautological imperative, the fundamental rule of domination. For whether a bank is a bank, or indeed whether a table is a table, or whether 2 plus 2 equals 4, and not 5 as Dostoevsky had it, is the real capitalist credence. When capital says I am interested in your money, it feigns profitability in order to secure credibility. This credibility comes from the economic order, creditability, while the credence attached to the tautology sums up in itself the identity of the capitalist order and comes from the symbolic order. 22. So just as there had been, for Marx as well, a naturalist fantasy of use-value, there is for us today an economistic fantasy of exchange-value. For us, in the structural play of the code, exchange-value plays the same role as use-value used to play in the market law of value, the role of the simulacrum of reference. 23. The American Senate has gone to the extent of calculating what it would cost to bring water back to the purity it had before the European conquest of the Americas, the 1491 standard, Christopher Columbus having landed, as we know, in 1492 $350 million. These millions matter little, however, since what the senators are in fact calculating is the cost of bringing the system itself back to the original purity of primitive accumulation, the golden age of labor power. They 1890, or indeed 1840, standard? In like fashion, the current monetary system dreams of gold and a gold standard to stabilize and regenerate fiduciary values. The current state of affairs is that free and unlimited speculation on the grounds of the loss of the gold referent edges closer every moment to catastrophe, an arbitrariness and an inflation of such proportions that the authority of money itself is toppled and loses all its credibility. Again we have a cyclical regeneration by means of reference. A critical regeneration is necessary in order to prevent financial exchanges from reaching the limits of unreality, where they would be destroyed. 24. There are, of course, contradictions remaining between the structural and the market law of value, just as, in a previous phase, there were between the law of the market and resistant pre-capitalist values, which contradictions have not completely disappeared. In this way, the ultimate end of the system is the control of death. Death is one of the structural markings of life. It also clashes with economic imperatives and a traditional logic of profit, the enormous cost of long-term care, hospitalization, and so on. A compromise results from this, an absurd equilibrium. We can afford to keep 35% of all leukemia sufferers alive. Assessing the marginal costs of death. Anything above this level and we let them die. But this is not cynical economics. On the contrary, the economy prevents the system from following the conclusions of its own logic and barring people's access to death. There is in fact a constant play between the two forms of value, controlled by a strategy aiming at intensifying the crisis. And although the crisis seems to require a solution, it is this solution already. 25. The gift, under the sign of gift exchange, has been made into the distinguishing mark of primitive economies, and at the same time into the alternative principle to the law of value and political economy. There is no worse mystification. The gift is our myth, the idealist myth correlative to our materialist myth, and we bury the primitives under both myths at the same time. The primitive symbolic process knows nothing of the gratuity of the gift, it knows only the challenge and the reversibility of exchanges. When this reversibility is broken, precisely by the unilateral possibility of giving, which presupposes the possibility of stockpiling value and transferring it in one direction only, then the properly symbolic relation is dead and power makes an appearance. It will merely be deployed thereafter throughout the economic apparatus of the contract. It is our operational fiction, our metaphysics, the idea that it is possible to accumulate stock value in its head, capital, to make it increase and multiply. This is the trap of the accumulation and capital. It is equally our fiction, however, to think that we may relinquish it absolutely, with the gift. The primitives know that this possibility does not. Page 48. Page 49. Exist, that the arresting of value on one term, the very possibility of isolating a segment of exchange, one side of the exchange, is unthinkable, that everything has a compensation, not in the contractual sense, but in the sense that the process of exchange is unavoidably reversible. They base all their relations on this incessant backfire, ambivalence, and death in exchange, whereas we base our order on the possibility of separating two distinct poles of exchange and making them autonomous. There follows either the equivalent exchange, the contract, or the inequivalent exchange. That has no compensation, the gift. But both, as we shall see, obey the same dislocation of the process and the same autonomization of value. 26. This is no doubt especially true in the phase of physical abjection and savage exploitation, in capitalist prostitution. Under the market law of value. How much of this remains in our phase, the structural law of value? 27. This is particularly clear when wages are unilaterally bestowed, imposed in negative taxation without any labor in return. The wage earner without equivalence, in this trans-economic contract, we see a pure domination and pure subservience to the gift and the premium emerge. 28. That is symbolic exchange. We must emphasize that it stands opposed to the entire liberal or Christian humanist ideology of the gift. The gift is the source and even the essence of power. Only the counter-gift, the reversibility of symbolic exchange, abolishes power. Page 49. Page 50. Next section 2. The order of simulacra.